In the winter of 1876, the floor of a small chapel inside the Tower of London started to sink. The pavement over the chancel dipped and buckled as though the earth underneath was giving way, and when Queen Victoria ordered the building restored and the workmen lifted the stones, they found out why. The ground under that chapel was packed with people, hundreds of them, buried fast and shallow, graves cut through older graves, coffins collapsed into each other, skeletons jumbled until the diggers could not tell where one body ended and the next began. Somewhere in that tangle lay two beheaded queens of England, a third queen who had reigned for 9 days, a duke whose executioner needed 5 blows and a butcher's knife, a knight poisoned by inches over 5 months, and a countess of 67 killed by a beginner who could not find her neck. Millions of people walk past that chapel every year with an ice cream. It stands on a mass grave, and this video is the story of how the ground got that full. Before we go any further, a quick hello, welcome in, and if you're settling down for a long one, good, because this is a long one. If you're new to the channel, welcome, it's lovely to have you, and if you're a regular, welcome back. Do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. A huge thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members who quietly keep this whole operation upright. If you'd like to join them, all the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Right, down to the river and back nearly 800 years before anyone thought to look under that floor. The tower begins with a foreigner's fear. William the Conqueror took England in 1066 and did not trust the city he had taken. London was enormous by the standards of the age, crowded, rich, and openly resentful of the Norman soldiers walking its streets. So William put a fortress on the southeast corner of the old Roman wall, right where the city met the river, and around 1078, the timber castle began turning into stone. The White Tower went up in pale Caen limestone shipped across the channel, 90 feet high, with walls 15 feet thick at the base. Nothing in England looked like it. That was the point. A monk writing not long afterward said the fortress was built against the fickleness of the vast and fierce population. In plainer terms, it existed to frighten Londoners, and it did that job before a single prisoner ever passed through its gates. The first prisoner arrived in 1100, and he set a tone the tower never quite shook off, because he escaped. Ranulph Flambard was a bishop, the chief tax-gatherer of William Rufus, and one of the most hated men in England. When Rufus died with an arrow through his chest in the New Forest, the new King Henry I needed a scapegoat for years of extortion, and Flambard fit beautifully. Into the White Tower he went. Being a bishop with money, he was allowed to keep his money, and he used it well. He had wine sent up to his quarters, casks of it, and inside one cask his friends had coiled a rope. On the chosen night, Flambard threw a feast for his guards, poured until every one of them was insensible on the floor, tied the rope to a pillar by the window, and climbed down the outside of the White Tower with his bishop's staff in hand. The rope was too short. He fell the last stretch, tore the skin from his hands and landed hard enough to hurt, but his friends were waiting at the bottom with horses, and he got away to Normandy. The tower's very first prisoner beat it. Plenty of the ones who came after would have traded anything for his luck. A Welsh prince tried the same trick a century and a half later and paid for it in the worst way available. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn was the eldest son of Llywelyn the Great, held in the Tower as a political hostage while England and Wales circled one another. By 1244, he had been locked up long enough to stop caring about the odds. On the night of the 1st of March, he knotted his bedsheets and cloths into a rope, fixed it to the window, and went over the side of the White Tower. Gruffydd was a big man, heavy-set from years of comfortable captivity, and the makeshift rope did what makeshift ropes do under a heavy man 90 feet up. The chronicler Matthew Paris, who took the trouble to record the state of the body, wrote that when they found him in the morning, his head and neck had been driven down into his chest between the shoulders. The drop had essentially folded him. His son Llywelyn, still a boy, learned about his father's death in that manner, and grew up to be the last sovereign Prince of Wales. Humiliations that began at the Tower had a habit of echoing down the generations. Under Edward I, the Tower stopped being merely a prison for the powerful and hosted something closer to a purge. In 1278, roughly 600 Jewish men and women were arrested across England on accusations of coin clipping, shaving slivers of silver from the edges of pennies, and were crammed into the Tower's cellars and subterranean spaces to await trial. Conditions down there were foul in the ordinary course of things, and with hundreds of bodies packed in, they became lethal. People died in those cells waiting for a hearing. In 1279, around 270 of the prisoners were hanged. Christians accused of exactly the same offense, and plenty were accused, mostly paid fines. 11 years later, Edward expelled the entire Jewish population from England, and the Tower's cellars had been a rehearsal for it. The fortress was barely 200 years old at that point, and had already worked out what it was for. Money, incidentally, ran through everything the Tower did, right down to the killing. Executioners were paid by the head. Warders charged prisoners for food, for bedding, for firewood, for the privilege of a window. A wealthy prisoner in the Tower could live nearly as well as he lived at home, with servants and dinner guests and a view of the river. A poor one could rot in the dark on the same corridor. Keep that in mind as we go, because the difference between a comfortable imprisonment and a slow, filthy death often came down to nothing grander than the contents of a man's purse. The Tower's defences, for all their 90 feet of stone, failed exactly once, and the failure produced a killing on Tower Hill more savage than anything the axe managed there in the following 4 centuries. In the summer of 1381, the peasants' revolt rolled into London. Tens of thousands of countrymen enraged by the poll tax, and the 14-year-old King Richard II took shelter in the Tower with his government. On the 14th of June, the boy king rode out to negotiate with the rebels at Mile End, and while he was gone, the garrison, hundreds of armed men behind the strongest walls in England, simply let the crowd in. Whether the gates were opened out of sympathy or plain fear, the chronicles argue, but in the rebels came, hundreds of them pouring across the drawbridges, and for a few hours the common people of England owned the Tower of London. They ransacked the royal apartments. They sat on the king's bed and invited each other to try it. Several, by the chronicler's scandalized report, demanded kisses from the king's own mother, who was hustled out by water, half fainting, and a party of them went hunting through the fortress for the men they had actually come for, and found them in the chapel of St. John, up in the White Tower at Mass. Simon Sudbury was Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, and in the rebels' eyes the author of the hated tax. He had heard the crowd coming and had chosen to finish the service. They dragged him from the altar, out of the White Tower, through the gates and up onto Tower Hill, along with the treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, and 2 others, and on the spot where the scaffold would stand for the next 4 centuries, they hacked the Archbishop of Canterbury's head off with a sword on a log. The man wielding it had no skill at all. A contemporary account puts the count at 8 strokes, the first of them landing badly enough that Sudbury's hand flew instinctively to the wound, and the blade took his fingertips with the next blow, and still he was alive part way through the mess of it. When the head finally came free, they nailed his archbishop's cap to his skull so everyone would know who he had been, and set it on London Bridge. His body lies at Canterbury with a cannonball resting where the head should be, because the head itself was rescued and carried to his hometown of Sudbury in Suffolk, where it remains to this day, a dry, brown, 400-year-old skull in a niche in the vestry wall of St. Gregory's Church, and the parish will show it to you if you ask nicely. Modern examiners who have handled it confirm the vertebra bears multiple cut marks. 8 strokes was, if anything, kind reporting. Set against that afternoon of chaos, the tower's usual medieval business was almost genteel, because for long stretches its most famous prisoners were kings, foreign ones, taken in battle and held for ransom, and their captivity ran to feather beds. John II of France, captured at Poitiers, kept a household in the tower with musicians and imported wine, while 2 countries haggled over the largest ransom in history. David II of Scotland spent years there in comfortable limbo. James I of Scotland, taken as a boy, grew up in English custody writing poetry. A cynic would say the Tower always understood the difference between a prisoner who was worth money and a prisoner who was worth more dead, and its entire history sorts neatly into those 2 ledgers. Now, before we get to the queens and the priests and the botched beheadings, the machinery itself needs a few minutes. The Tower's reputation for torture rests on real iron and real timber, and the way those devices worked on a human body has survived in enough detail to describe properly. English law, strangely enough, never recognized torture. Common law forbade it. What happened instead was that the Crown issued special warrants, signed by the monarch or the Privy Council, authorizing named officers to put named prisoners to the question. Between the early 1500s and 1640, somewhere around 80 of those warrants survive in the records, and nearly all of them point to one place. If the state wanted a man broken in England, the state sent him to the Tower. The most famous instrument had a family nickname. The rack in the Tower was called the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after John Holland, Duke of Exeter, Constable of the Tower in the 1420s, who is credited with installing the device, or at least making it a fixture. The name has a horrible domestic warmth to it, as though the machine were a member of the household, and in a sense it was, because it stayed in service for 200 years. The mechanics were simple: a wooden frame, roughly the length of a bed, rollers at the head and the foot. The prisoner laid on his back, wrists tied to one roller, ankles to the other, and then the levers were turned. First the slack came out of the ropes, then the slack came out of the man. The body lifted off the bed of the frame and hung taut in the air, and from that moment every quarter turn of the wheel was translated directly into the joints. Shoulders went first, as a rule. The head of the arm bone levers out of its socket with an audible pop that people in the room described hearing across the chamber. Hips followed, elbows, knees, wrists, ankles, cartilage tears. The ligaments that hold the skeleton together stretch, then shred, and the fibers of the large muscles snap in strings. A man racked hard once might never again raise his arms above his head. Racked twice or 3 times, he might not walk. The interrogators knew all this and used the knowledge as a schedule. Show the prisoner the rack on the first visit, rack him gently on the second, save the full extension for the third, when he had spent 2 nights alone in the dark, listening to his own joints ache and doing the imagining for them. Somewhere in the same building, tradition says the basement of the White Tower sat the rack's opposite number, and if anything, it was the crueler invention. Sir Leonard Skevington, lieutenant of the Tower under Henry VIII, devised an iron frame that folded a prisoner instead of stretching him. It went by his name at first, Skevington's Gyves, and then by the grimmer nickname the Scavenger's Daughter, so that the Tower now kept 2 daughters. The prisoner knelt, and the frame was closed over him, an iron A-shape with the head fixed at the top, hands clamped at the middle, ankles at the base, and then it was screwed shut, pressing the head toward the knees, compressing the rib cage, folding the spine into a ball a human spine is not meant to make. Descriptions from the period say that after an hour or 2, blood was forced from the nose and the ears, and in some accounts from the fingertips, as the pressure inside the crushed torso had nowhere else to go. The rack pulled a man apart. The Scavenger's Daughter squeezed him until he leaked. One of its known victims left us his own words, cut into a wall of the Beauchamp Tower, where you can still find them today. Thomas Mia, an Irishman suspected of dealing with rebels, carved this in 1581. By torture strange my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied. The carving is neat, patient work. He had time. Then the cells, and honestly, the cells may have broken more men than the iron ever did. Little Ease was a hole beneath the White Tower measuring about 3 feet 11 inches in every direction, 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, give or take, with no window and no light. A grown man inside it could not stand, could not sit with his legs out, could not lie down. He crouched, folded over his own knees in absolute darkness, and stayed that way. Hours in Little Ease became a day became several. The cramping starts in the thighs and the back within the first hour. And after that, the body has no position left to change to, so the pain simply accumulates. Edmund Campion went into Little Ease when he arrived at the Tower, and will come to what else was done to him shortly. Guy Fawkes, by long tradition, spent his first days in the same hole. Below even that was the pit, a shaft cut down into the rock, 20 feet deep by some accounts, entirely without light, where a prisoner was lowered and left with the rats and the damp. No warrant needed to be signed for the cells. They counted as accommodation. One more device belongs in this inventory, and it produced the single best first-hand account of torture ever written in England, so I'll save the full description for the man who lived it. The manacles were iron gauntlets fixed high on a wall or a pillar. The prisoner's wrists went into them, his arms above his head, and then whatever he had been standing on was taken away, so that his entire body weight hung from his wrists and shoulders for hours at a stretch. It sounds almost gentle next to the rack. A Jesuit priest named John Gerard hung in them in 1597 and wrote down exactly what it does to a body, and when we reach the reign of Elizabeth I'll give you his words, because nothing I could write comes close. Thumbscrews, iron gauntlets that crushed rather than held, the simple expedient of starvation and cold. All of it lived in the same stones. What I want you to hold on to is how bureaucratic it all was. Warrants signed, sessions minuted, officers of the Crown, lawyers among them, standing in a cellar making notes while a machine dislocated a human being one joint at a time, then going home to dinner. The horror of the Tower was rarely frenzied. It was administered. The Wars of the Roses gave the Tower its first murdered king. Henry VI was a gentle, pious, mentally fragile man who had inherited the crowns of England and France before his first birthday, and spent his adult life being fought over like a purse. By 1471, he had been deposed, restored, and deposed again, and he was being held in the Wakefield Tower, spending most of his waking hours at prayer, which by that stage of his life was more or less all he did. On the 4th of May, his cause died at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and his only son, the 17-year-old Prince Edward, died with it, cut down either in the rout or immediately after it. With the boy gone, Henry stopped being useful as a hostage. A living deposed king with a living heir is a threat you manage. A living deposed king with no heir is just a loose end. Edward IV rode back into London in triumph on the 21st of May. That same night, Henry VI died in the Wakefield Tower. The official announcement said he had died of pure displeasure and melancholy on hearing the news of Tewkesbury, and you can decide for yourself how likely it is that a man's grief killed him within hours of his rival's return to the city, at the precise moment his death became convenient. A chronicle written within a few years of the event, Warkworth's Chronicle, is blunter. It records that King Henry, being enwarded in prison in the Tower of London, was put to death between 11 and 12 of the clock, and it adds one detail that has hung over English history ever since, that the Duke of Gloucester was at the Tower that night. Gloucester was Edward's youngest brother, 18 years old, and he would grow up to be Richard III. Whether he wielded anything himself, whether he carried an order, whether he was simply in the building, no record says. Tradition fixed the deed in the small oratory of the Wakefield Tower, at the prayer desk, the king killed while he knelt. His body was displayed at St. Paul's the next day so the public could see he was dead, and several contemporary writers noted that the corpse bled onto the pavement as it lay there, fresh blood from a man supposedly dead of sadness. 4.5 centuries later, somebody checked. In 1910, Henry's remains, by then at Windsor, were exhumed and examined. The skull was found much broken, in the examiner's words, and to one side of it clung a mass of brown hair, matted with what appeared to be blood. Grief does not crack a skull. Every year on the 21st of May, representatives of Eton and King's College, Cambridge, the two great schools Henry founded, walk into the Wakefield Tower and lay lilies and roses on the spot where he is said to have died. They have done it for a century, a quiet annual apology paid to a man murdered at his prayers. 7 years after Henry, the Tower swallowed a royal duke in circumstances people have been arguing about for 500 years, and I'd rather show you the pieces than settle it for you. George, Duke of Clarence, was the middle brother between King Edward and Richard of Gloucester, and he was a lifelong problem. He had betrayed Edward once already, switching sides in the Civil War and switching back. He drank heavily. After his wife died, he became erratic and dangerous, at one point having one of her servants seized, dragged to a gallows, and hanged on his personal say-so, no trial worth the name. By 1477, he was dabbling with men accused of using sorcery against the king and openly suggesting Edward was illegitimate. Edward finally had enough. Clarence was arrested, tried before Parliament with the king himself acting as accuser, condemned for treason, and on the 18th of February 1478, he was executed privately inside the Tower. A closed door, away from the green and any crowd. Almost immediately, the story got out that he had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey, a huge barrel of sweet Greek wine. Within a few years, foreign chroniclers were repeating it as fact, and it never went away. A butt held about 105 gallons, half a ton, more than deep enough to drown a grown man if his head were forced under, and the detail had a horrible aptness for a duke famous for his drinking. Either a mocking choice by his killers or, in some tellings, a last request, the condemned man picking his own method with a shrug. When remains believed to be Clarence's were examined centuries later at Tewkesbury Abbey, the skull was intact. No axe had touched that neck, whoever the bones belonged to. Something quieter killed him behind that closed door, and drowning leaves no mark on bone. One more detail, and then we'll let it rest. Clarence had a small daughter named Margaret. In her portrait as a grown woman, painted decades later, she wears a bracelet, and hanging from the bracelet is a tiny charm in the shape of a barrel. Hold that image of Margaret, because we are going to meet her again at the end of her life, on the worst morning anyone ever spent on Tower Green. 5 years on from Clarence, the Tower produced the darkest story it has ever held, and it starts with a king dying too soon. Edward IV went suddenly in April of 1483, only 40 years old, worn out by his appetites, leaving 2 sons. The elder, Edward, was 12. The younger, Richard of York, was 9. The boy's uncle, Richard of Gloucester, the same man who had been at the Tower the night Henry VI died, was named Lord Protector, guardian of the realm and of his nephews, until the 12-year-old could be crowned. Gloucester moved fast. He intercepted the young king on the road to London, arrested the boy's maternal relatives who were escorting him, and later had them beheaded. He installed his nephew in the Tower, and here I should say plainly that this looked normal at the time. The Tower was a royal palace as much as a prison, and kings traditionally lodged there before their coronations. Nobody watching young Edward ride through the gates thought they were watching a boy being buried alive in stone. His coronation was set for June. Preparations went ahead. Robes were ordered. Then came the council meeting of Friday the 13th of June, 1483, in the White Tower, and the most sudden killing in English political history. William Hastings was the late king's closest friend, a fixture of the court for 20 years, and loyal to the boy king absolutely. That morning's meeting opened pleasantly. Thomas More's account, written a generation later from the testimony of men who knew the room, has Gloucester arriving in good humour and asking the Bishop of Ely to send for a dish of strawberries from his garden in Holborn. Then Gloucester left and returned changed, scowling, chewing his lip, and demanded to know what punishment men deserved who plotted his destruction by sorcery. He bared his left arm, withered, he said, by witchcraft, and accused Hastings of conspiring against him. Hastings began to answer. Gloucester struck the table. Armed men burst in on the signal. In the scuffle, a halberd blow aimed into the crowd nearly took off another councillor's head, and Hastings was seized and told, by way of complete legal process, that the Protector would not dine until his head was off. They dragged him out onto the green beside the chapel. No scaffold existed, because none had been planned an hour earlier, so they threw down a squared timber log lying there for building repairs, pushed him over it, and beheaded him on the spot. A priest was found so he could gabble a confession first. That was the entire trial, sentence, and execution of a great officer of the realm, conducted in less time than it takes to serve strawberries. Within days, sermons were being preached declaring the two princes illegitimate on the grounds that their father had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying their mother. Parliament obliged. The 12-year-old in the Tower stopped being Edward V and became plain Edward Bastard, and his uncle was crowned Richard III in July. The younger boy, Richard of York, had by then been taken from his mother, who was hiding in sanctuary at Westminster with her daughters. Churchmen persuaded her to give the 9-year-old up, arguing the boy's brother needed company. The Archbishop of Canterbury pledged his own soul for the child's safety. She let him go. Both sons were now in the Tower, and one contemporary observer in London, an Italian named Dominic Mancini, wrote down what happened next in real time. The boys, he said, were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the Tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, till at length they ceased to appear altogether. Their attendants were dismissed. The last of them, a physician named Dr. Argentine, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. a 12-year-old going to confession every day because he had worked out what was coming. Mancini added that when the boy's name was mentioned in London that summer, men wept. After the summer of 1483, no one ever saw either prince again. No bodies were shown and no funeral was held, and that official silence is itself part of the evidence, because a usurper with 2 dead nephews on his hands and a clean story to tell would ordinarily have produced the bodies and blamed a fever. Richard never did. Rumours that the boys were dead were circulating in London within weeks and had reached France by January, where the Chancellor stood up in front of the Estates General and openly accused Richard of massacring his brother's children. The fullest account of how they died came 30 years later from Thomas More, who said he had it from men involved. Take it with whatever caution you think 30 years and a hostile dynasty deserve. But here is what he wrote. Richard, uneasy on his new throne, sent word to the constable of the Tower to put the boys to death. The constable refused. So the task went to Sir James Tyrrell, an ambitious knight willing to rise by dirty work, who was given the keys of the Tower for one night. Tyrrell delegated the act to 2 men, Miles Forrest, one of the boys' existing keepers, a fellow fleshed in murder before time, in More's phrase, and John Dighton, his own horsekeeper, a big, broad, square, strong knave. About midnight, the 2 came into the chamber where the children lay sleeping in their bed, and suddenly lapped them up among the clothes, so bewrapped them and entangled them, keeping down by force the feather bed and pillows hard unto their mouths, that within a while, smored and stifled, their breath failing, they gave up to God their innocent souls. Smothered under their own bedding, held down until they stopped moving, and More adds that the murderers laid the bodies out naked on the bed and fetched Tyrrell to inspect them before burying them at the stairfoot, meetly deep in the ground under a great heap of stones. In More's telling, Richard later disliked so mean a grave for king's sons and had a priest move the bodies elsewhere, and the priest died with the secret. Tyrrell, for what it adds, was executed for unrelated treason in 1502, and reports circulated that he confessed to the murders while awaiting death, though no text of any confession survives. Other versions of the boy's end were on the market almost from the start. One early writer, John Rastell, recorded a story that the bodies were shut into a chest and dropped into the Thames on the way to Flanders, so the tide could keep the secret. Some insisted the younger boy was smuggled abroad alive, and in the 1490s a young man named Perkin Warbeck raised armies claiming to be exactly that, Richard of York grown up, and enough powerful people believed him, or found it useful to believe him, that it took Henry VII years to run him down. Warbeck ended in the Tower too, in a cell, they said, where he saw neither sun nor moon, and was hanged in 1499, and plenty of people over the centuries have pointed out that Richard III was never the only man with a motive. The Duke of Buckingham had access, ambition, and a claim of his own. Henry VII, who took the crown from Richard in 1485, needed the princes dead just as urgently, since he married their sister and his title depended on her legitimacy, and hers depended on theirs. The record does not close the question. It just narrows it to a short list of men, all of whom had reasons. and one locked fortress. Then, in 1674, the ground gave up something. Workmen demolishing a staircase attached to the White Tower, digging down about 10 feet, struck a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. Contemporary reports mention scraps of velvet found with the bones, a fabric restricted in that era to the highest ranks. No paupers' children wore velvet. The location matched More's stairfoot, under a great heap of stones, uncomfortably well, allowing for his claim that the bodies were later moved. Charles II accepted the identification, and Christopher Wren designed a white marble urn for the bones, which were placed in Westminster Abbey, where they still are, a few feet from the tomb of the sister who became Henry VII's queen. The urn was opened once, in 1933, and 2 examiners, Tanner and Wright, spent days with the contents. They found the remains of 2 children whose ages they put at roughly 12 or 13 and 9 or 10, matching the princes in 1483 almost exactly. They noted a stain on the facial bones of the elder child, which they suggested could be consistent with suffocation, though that interpretation has been argued over ever since, and they found extensive disease in the elder child's jaw, a chronic bone infection that would have caused him constant pain in his final months. A 12-year-old confessing his sins daily, waiting to die, with an abscessed jaw aching the whole time. The examination had real limits. The 2 men went in believing they were looking at the princes and worked toward that conclusion. They could not determine whether the skeletons were even male, since that is difficult with children's bones, and impossible with the methods of 1933. No DNA test has ever been permitted, though the means exist and living comparison lines have been traced. The urn stays sealed. Whoever those 2 children were, someone put them in a box and buried them 10 feet under a staircase in a royal fortress, and nobody buries children like that who died of anything innocent. The Tudors, once they had the crown, turned the Tower into the busiest killing ground it would ever be, and the busiest reign of all belonged to Henry VIII. Under Henry, the fortress ate his ministers, his friends, his bishops, and 2 of his wives, and we're going to take those deaths one at a time. Every one of them carries details no list could hold. Start with the old bishop. John Fisher was Bishop of Rochester, nearly 70, the man who had preached at the funerals of Henry's father and grandmother, one of the most respected churchmen in Europe. His crime was refusing to swear that Henry, rather than the Pope, was head of the church in England. Into the Tower he went in the spring of 1534, and the Crown made a point of treating him shabbily. 14 months in a cold cell stripped the flesh off him. A letter he wrote from the Tower to Thomas Cromwell that December survives, and it is a hard thing to get through. An elderly bishop begging for basics. "I beseech you to be a good master unto me in my necessity," he wrote, "for I have neither shirt nor suit, nor yet other clothes that are necessary for me to wear, but that be ragged and rent too shamefully. My diet also, God knoweth how slender it is at many times." He asked for a priest to hear his confession and some books to keep his mind from despair. While he sat starving in rags, the Pope, hoping to shield him, made him a cardinal. Henry's response went around Europe. "Let the Pope send the hat when he will, the king said. "Fisher shall wear it on his shoulders, for head he shall have none to set it on." He kept that promise on the 22nd of June 1535. Fisher was by then so wasted that he could not walk to Tower Hill, so they carried him out of the gates in a chair, and witnesses who saw him stripped at the scaffold were shocked at the body. A long, dry frame with the skin sunk between the bones. A man already most of the way to a corpse before the axe did anything. He was steady, spoke briefly, forgave the headsman, and died at one stroke. Then came the aftermath, and this part is genuinely grim. His head went onto a pole on London Bridge, parboiled first as heads were, to keep them from rotting too fast. Except Fisher's head did not decay. Day after day it stayed up there looking, people said, fresher and ruddier than it had in life, as though the old man were watching the city, and crowds began gathering on the bridge to stare at it, so many that carts could barely pass. After a fortnight, the authorities had the head knocked off its pole and thrown into the Thames, officially to make room. The room was needed for the next head, which belonged to his friend. Thomas More had been Lord Chancellor of England, the King's brilliant, funny, impossible friend, and he went to the Tower for the same refusal, 14 months in the Bell Tower. From his cell window, in May of 1535, he watched something designed, perhaps deliberately, to break his nerve. 3 Carthusian priors, monks of the strictest and gentlest order in England, were dragged out of the tower on hurdles, on their backs, tied down, to be pulled through the filth of the streets to Tyburn. They died there in their habits, hanged, cut down alive, and butchered, hearts pulled out, quartered, and one of the severed arms was later nailed up over the gate of their own monastery to instruct the survivors. More stood at his window with his daughter Margaret and watched them go, and instead of terror he showed her something closer to envy. "Look, Meg," he said, "these blessed fathers be now as cheerfully going to their deaths as bridegrooms to their marriage." He knew exactly what a hurdle to Tyburn meant. He had seen the sentence in writing dozens of times as a judge. More's own sentence, after a trial whose verdict was arranged in advance, was that same full traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, and Henry, in a mood someone called mercy, commuted it to beheading. More's reported reply was that he prayed God his friends never had need of the king's mercy. On the 6th of July 1535 they took him up Tower Hill, and he kept his humour to the last stare. The scaffold was rickety, and More turned to the lieutenant beside him. "See me safe up," he said, "and for my coming down I can shift for myself." He told the crowd only that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. To the executioner he said, "Pluck up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short. Take heed therefore thou strike not awry, for saving of thine honesty." Kneeling at the block, he moved his beard carefully aside so the blade would miss it, remarking that his beard, at least, had committed no treason. One stroke. His head went onto the pole Fisher's had just vacated. It should have stayed there a month and then gone into the river, and here his daughter enters the story one last time. Margaret Roper bribed the bridge-keeper. When her father's head was due to be tipped into the Thames, it was handed down to her instead, and she kept it. She was hauled before the council for it, and answered them flatly that her father's head should not be food for fishes, and somehow she talked her way home. She preserved the head in spices by most accounts for the rest of her short life. and when Margaret died 9 years later, the head was placed in the coffin with her, or by another account in her lap. It rests now in the Roper family vault beneath a church in Canterbury, in a niche behind an iron grille, where it has been seen and described as recently as the 19th century. A blackened skull in a box, the last physical remnant of the wittiest man ever to climb Tower Hill. 10 months after More's head came down off the bridge, the tower received a Queen of England, and everything about the next 19 days was unprecedented, because no one had ever executed an anointed English queen before. The machinery had to be invented as they went. Anne Boleyn arrived by barge on the 2nd of May 1536 in daylight, so the river traffic could watch. 3 years earlier she had come up this same stretch of water for her coronation, with the guns firing salutes and the city hung with banners. Now the guns fired to announce a state prisoner. The charges were adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George, and plotting the king's death. And the speed of it all still startles historians who work through the paperwork, because the legal commissions that made her trial possible were issued before some of the alleged offences had even been reported. The commission came first. The evidence was fitted afterward. Of the 5 men, 4 were courtiers, gentlemen of the king's own privy chamber, and 1 was a musician, Mark Smeaton, and Smeaton is the only one who ever confessed. He confessed after a session with Thomas Cromwell's men, and 2 different stories circulated at the time about how that confession was obtained. One said he was racked. Another, from a chronicle written by a servant in Cromwell's own household, said a knotted rope was twisted around his head at the eyes, tightening with each turn of a stick until he talked. Either way, a low-born musician had no protections a gentleman had. Everyone at court understood that, and Smeaton said whatever ended the pain. He never retracted it, possibly because retracting it would have meant a return visit. We know an unusual amount about Anne's state of mind in the Tower, and the source of that knowledge is bleak. Her jailer, the Constable Sir William Kingston, was reporting her every word back to Cromwell by letter, and the ladies placed around her were chosen informers, so the surveillance that destroyed her also preserved her voice. When Kingston received her at the gate, she asked him whether she was going into a dungeon. "No, madam," he told her. "You shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation, the same rooms." She broke at that. "It is too good for me," she cried. "Jesu, have mercy on me." And Kingston records that she fell down weeping, and then, in the same fit, fell into a great laughing, and she did so many times afterward, sobbing that turned into laughter that turned back, hour after hour. She asked Kingston, "Shall I die without justice?" He answered that the poorest subject the king had justice, and Kingston wrote that she laughed at that too. She was 28 or so, alone, watched around the clock by women paid to repeat her words, and her mind kept circling the men accused with her, worrying about whether they had food, whether anyone would make their beds. The trials were brisk. The 4 commoners were condemned on the 12th of May. Anne and her brother were tried inside the Tower on the 15th, before 2,000 spectators in the Great Hall, with their own uncle presiding, and among the peers passing judgment sat Henry Percy, the man Anne had wanted to marry in her youth, before the crown got in the way. He voted guilty with the rest, then collapsed and had to be carried out. Anne answered the charges clearly, and by every surviving account, well. It changed nothing. Her sentence gave the king the choice of burning her alive or beheading her at his pleasure. Those words are in the sentence, and Henry chose the blade. On the 17th of May, the 5 men died on Tower Hill, her brother George first, and Anne, lodged inside the walls, would have heard the crowd. That same day her marriage was annulled, declared never to have existed, a piece of legal surrealism nobody dwelt on, since a woman who had never been the king's wife could hardly have committed adultery against him, and yet the death sentence for that adultery stood. Henry granted his wife one refinement, and the paperwork behind it is the coldest detail in the whole story. English axemen were considered too crude for a queen, so an expert swordsman was summoned from Calais, a man who beheaded kneeling prisoners with a heavy two-handed sword and never missed. The fee recorded was £23, 6 shillings and 8pence, plus a reward, and by the reckoning of Anne's biographer that comes to something like £16,000 in modern money. The summons had to travel to Calais, and the man had to travel back, and if you count the days along that timeline, the order appears to have gone out before her trial had delivered its verdict. The executioner was on the road while the court was still pretending to weigh the evidence. His journey ran late, and the delay tortured her more than anything else in those 19 days. Anne was told she would die on the morning of the 18th of May. She stayed up most of that night praying, and dawn came, and nothing happened, and hours passed. And finally Kingston came to tell her the execution had moved to the next day. Her answer is in his letter. Master Kingston, I hear say I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain. Kingston, trying to be kind, told her the pain would be little. It was so subtle. And then she said the thing everyone remembers. I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. She put her hands around her throat as she said it, and laughed heartily. Kingston, a professional keeper of the condemned for years, added his own bewildered note for Cromwell. I have seen many men and also women executed, and they have been in great sorrow, but to my knowledge this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. The morning of the 19th of May 1536 was clear. A scaffold hung in black stood inside the walls, built high so the invited crowd of perhaps 1,000 could see, officials, aldermen, foreign observers, no general public. Anne came out in a grey damask gown over a crimson kirtle, her hair bound up under a headdress, attended by 4 weeping women. Every account agrees she was composed, and more than composed, almost light. Her speech from the scaffold was short and careful, and she praised the man who was killing her. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, because her daughter Elizabeth was 2 years old and still in his power. And every word Anne spoke in her last 5 minutes was spoken with that child in mind. She asked the crowd to pray for her. She did not confess guilt, and she did not protest innocence, the one omission an admission, the other a provocation, and she threaded the needle between them. No block stood on that scaffold. The sword needed the victim upright, so Anne knelt in the straw, straight-backed, and one of her ladies tied the blindfold. She began repeating aloud, over and over, "O Lord God, have pity on my soul. To Christ I commend my soul." And witnesses said her lips never stopped. The executioner had hidden the sword in the straw so she would not see it. Even blindfolded, she kept turning her head slightly toward the sounds around her, and so he used a trick of his trade. He called out toward the steps, "Bring me the sword," as though it had not yet arrived, and Anne's head moved toward his voice, settling her neck into position, and in that instant he took the sword from the straw and swung. One stroke. The head came away so fast that the assembled crowd stood confused for a moment about whether anything had happened, and then the cannon fired to tell the city, and several witnesses swore that when the executioner held the head up, the eyes and the lips were still moving. Whatever those movements were, reflex or the last flickers of something worse, the people who saw them never forgot them. Nobody had built her a coffin. 19 days of meticulous planning, a swordsman imported from another country, invitations issued, and no one in the entire apparatus of the English state had thought to order a box for the body of the Queen of England. Her ladies, no officials helping them, wrapped the body and the head in white cloth and carried them into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few yards away, and someone fetched, from the armoury, an elm chest made for storing bow staves. Into the arrow chest went Anne Boleyn, her head laid beside her because the chest was not built for a body, and she was buried under the chancel floor in an unmarked spot, next to the brother executed 2 days before her. Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour the following morning and married within 11 days. The man who built the case against Anne got 4 more years before the same machine came for him. Thomas Cromwell was the blacksmith's son who had risen to run England for Henry, and his fall arrived without warning at a council meeting in June 1540. Arrest at the table, the order of the Garter torn off his chest by hand, while his fellow councillors shouted traitor at him. He was condemned by act of attainder, no trial at all, a legal shortcut he himself had sharpened for use on other people, and from the Tower he wrote to the king a letter that ends with a line that still hits hard on the page: "Most gracious Prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." Henry had the letter re-recited to him several times, they say, and did nothing. Cromwell went up Tower Hill on the 28th of July 1540, and his death is the first entry in the Tower's long ledger of butchered executions. The chronicler Edward Hall, who admired him, wrote that Cromwell patiently suffered the stroke of the axe by a ragged and butcherly wretch who very ungoodly performed the office. Other pens went further. One account describes the headsman, possibly drunk, possibly a deliberate insult by way of an unskilled man, hacking into the skull and shoulders rather than the neck, needing repeated blows while the crowd groaned, 1/2 an hour of work by the wildest version. Some sober witnesses recorded only a beheading and no scandal, so the true count of strokes is lost somewhere between 2 and horrifying. But the phrase ragged and butcherly came from a man who was standing there, and it stuck. Cromwell's boiled head joined the collection on London Bridge, set facing away from the city, a last editorial touch. And Henry, the same day his great minister was being hacked apart on the hill, got married to a 19-year-old. Catherine Howard was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, small, pretty, and by the standards of the court, almost a child. Henry was 49, enormous, with an ulcerated leg that stank and had to be drained, and he adored her, called her his rose without a thorn, showered her in jewels. She had grown up half-supervised in the crowded household of her step-grandmother, where a music teacher named Henry Mannocks had interfered with her when she was around 13, and a young gentleman named Francis Derham had been sharing her bed by the time she was 15, calling her his wife. None of this was mentioned when she married the king. Worse, once she was queen, she began meeting a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper, one of the king's favourite gentlemen, in back stairs and stool chambers on the royal progresses, and the meetings were arranged, doors watched and keys carried, by one of her ladies, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George. The same woman whose husband had gone to the block over accusations of this exact species. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained what Jane Rochford thought she was doing. The whole structure fell in November 1541, when a reformer with knowledge of Catherine's past passed it to Archbishop Cranmer. And Cranmer, not daring to say it aloud, left a letter on the king's seat in the chapel at Hampton Court. Henry's first reaction was disbelief. His second, once the confessions started coming in, frightened the council. He called for a sword to kill her himself, raged that she would never have such delight in her lewdness as she should have torture in her death, and then wept openly in front of his counsellors about his ill luck in wives. Catherine, held at Hampton Court, was hysterical for days, and a story attached itself to those days that guides at Hampton Court still tell, that she broke away from her guards and ran screaming down the gallery toward the chapel where Henry was at Mass, to throw herself at him and beg, and was dragged back before reaching the door. No contemporary document records the scene. It surfaces later, and the gallery has been called haunted ever since. Whatever happened in that corridor, the panic behind the story was real. She was around 19, and she knew exactly what her family did to disgraced queens, because her own cousin's body was lying in the chapel she was headed for the Tower to see. The men died first at Tyburn in December. Culpeper, the gentleman, was granted a simple beheading. Derham got the full sentence, and it returns so often tonight that it should be spelled out once in full. Hanged, drawn, and quartered worked like this. The prisoner was dragged to the gallows on a hurdle, a wooden sled, face up behind a horse through the mud and refuse of the streets, with the crowd free to throw whatever came to hand. He was hanged by the neck, but only briefly, cut down, while still alive and conscious. That was the whole design. Then he was stripped and castrated, the parts burned in a brazier in front of his eyes. Then the executioner opened his belly with a knife and drew out his bowels, unlooping them by hand, and burned those too, while the man watched, and skilled practitioners took pride in reaching the heart while it still beat. Only then came beheading, and the body was chopped into 4 quarters, which were parboiled with bay and cumin to keep the birds off, and nailed up at prominent spots around the city. Francis Derham suffered every stage of that, in full, for the crime of having loved Catherine Howard before the king ever saw her. Both men's heads went up on London Bridge. Catherine was brought to the Tower by barge in February 1542, and the route matters. The river passage ran under London Bridge, beneath the gatehouse where the heads stood on their poles, and Culpeper and Derham had been up there for 2 months by then, boiled, tarred, eyeless from the birds. The Queen's barge passed directly below them on her way to the Tower. Whether she looked up, no one recorded. She had one request left in her, and it is the request everyone remembers. On the evening of the 12th of February, told she would die the next morning, Catherine asked that the block be brought to her room. They brought it, the actual block, and the condemned Queen of England spent part of her last night kneeling in her chamber, practicing laying her head on it, positioning her chin over the hollow, so that in the morning she would do it gracefully and not fumble in front of the crowd. She was 19, perhaps 20. In the morning she was so weak, from fear or from days of not eating, that she needed help climbing the scaffold steps, and she made a brief conventional speech, saying her punishment was worthy and just, asking prayers for the king. The rehearsal worked. She placed her head as she had practiced, and the axe took it off in one blow. Then the second woman was brought up onto the same scaffold, still wet, and Jane Rochford's end involves a piece of lore from the very darkest shelf of Henry VIII's final years. In the Tower, under interrogation, Lady Rochford's mind had given way. The Imperial Ambassador Chappuis reported that on the 3rd day of her imprisonment, she was seized with a fit of madness by which her brain is affected. And English law, even Henry's England, forbade executing the insane. Henry's solution was not clemency. He had Parliament pass a new act specifically providing that a person who went mad after being condemned could be executed anyway, and he sent his own physicians to Lady Rochford in the Tower with instructions to treat her, the ambassador noting the king desired her recovery chiefly that he might afterwards have her executed as an example. Doctors, working to restore a woman's sanity so that she could legally have her head cut off. They got her well enough. On the scaffold she was reported calm, confessed generally to a long list of sins, and died at a stroke moments after the girl whose secrets she had carried. The two of them went under the chancel floor of St. Peter ad Vincula into the shrinking patch of ground where Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn already lay, so that by February 1542, one small Tower chapel held 2 headless queens of England who were cousins, a headless brother, and the sister-in-law who had outlived them all by 6 years and joined them anyway. Henry died in 1547, mountainous and rotting, and you might expect the Tower to have quietened with him gone. Instead, his children's reigns fed it some of its youngest victims, and the youngest of all was a bookish girl who never wanted any of it. Lady Jane Grey was Henry's great niece, raised on Greek and Plato, by common report happiest alone with a book while the rest of her family hunted. When the boy, King Edward VI, lay dying in 1553, his Protestant council could not stomach the throne passing to his Catholic sister Mary, and the Duke of Northumberland engineered a scheme marrying his son Guildford Dudley to Jane, then having the dying king name Jane his heir. She was 16. When they told her she was queen, witnesses said she fell to the ground weeping and protested that the crown was not her right, and Mary was the lawful heir. And then, pressed by her parents and her father-in-law and the assembled power of the council, she gave in. She entered the Tower as queen on the 10th of July 1553, through the gates in state, and the entire country declined to follow the script. Mary raised her standard, the counties flocked to her, the council changed sides within days, and Jane's own father came into her chamber and tore down the cloth of estate over her head with his own hands, telling her she was no longer queen. Her recorded reply was to ask whether she could go home. She never left the building. 9 days a queen, and the Tower simply reclassified her. The same walls, the same rooms, queen to prisoner without moving her luggage. For months it looked survivable. Mary, to her credit, had no appetite for killing her teenage cousin, and Jane's captivity was gentle, decent lodgings in the gentleman jailer's house overlooking the green, books, walks, an allowance. She was tried for treason in November and condemned, sentence suspended, and the quiet expectation around court was an eventual pardon. Then, in January 1554, Jane's father joined Wyatt's rebellion against Mary's Spanish marriage, an armed rising that reached the gates of London, and in one stroke he converted his daughter from an embarrassment into a standing threat. Any future rebellion could raise Jane's name whether she consented or never heard about it. Mary signed the warrant. The girl was given a few days' grace while the Queen sent her own chaplain, Feckenham, to convert her to Catholicism and save at least her soul, and the two of them held long, courteous theological debates in her cell, the 16-year-old giving as good as she got. She refused to convert. She also asked Feckenham to stand with her on the scaffold, and he did. The morning of the 12th of February 1554 was arranged with a cruelty that may have been mere scheduling, though it is hard to believe nobody noticed. Her husband Guildford, himself around 18 or 19, was taken out first, to public execution on Tower Hill. He had asked to see Jane one last time the night before, and she declined, sending word that it would only disturb the holy tranquility with which they should both prepare, and that they would meet shortly elsewhere. From her window in the jailer's house, she watched him walk out through the gates with the crowd noise rising beyond the wall. A short while later, the cart came back in. On its boards lay Guildford's body, and beside it, wrapped in a cloth, his head, and the cart's route to the chapel ran directly beneath her window. Jane saw all of it. Witnesses heard her cry out, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford," and then compose herself, because her own escort was already waiting at the door. Her scaffold stood on the green, the private ground, the same patch as Anne Boleyn's. She walked to it with her prayer book open in her hands and never stopped consulting it, and observers said she was entirely calm, more so than the men escorting her. Her speech was brief. She admitted the act of accepting the crown was unlawful, denied she had ever desired it, declared she died a true Christian woman, and asked the people to pray for her while she lived. That last clause is hers, while I am alive. She recited the 51st Psalm in English, the Miserere, "Have mercy upon me, O God," all the way through. She handed her gloves and handkerchief to her attendant and the prayer book to the lieutenant, having written a farewell message inside its pages for him. The executioner knelt and asked her forgiveness, standard courtesy, and she gave it, adding one request: "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Then, kneeling in the straw, she suddenly asked him, "Will you take it off before I lay me down?" Meaning her head. Would he strike while she was still upright and unready? And he reassured her, "No, madam." She tied the blindfold over her own eyes herself, and then the composure that had held through 9 days as queen, 7 months as a prisoner, her husband's cart, and her own scaffold speech, broke on a practical detail nobody had thought to manage. Blindfolded, she reached out for the block, and her hands found only air. She groped left and right, touched nothing, and the panic is preserved verbatim in the account written days later. "What shall I do?" she said. "Where is it?" A 16-year-old, blind in front of a silent crowd, on her knees, patting the straw for the thing that was about to kill her, and every official on that scaffold stood frozen. Someone in the crowd, the account says one of the bystanders, climbed up and guided her hands onto the block. She laid her head down and said, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And the axe came down, and the enormous quantity of blood shocked even people who attended executions as a habit, from so small a body. Her body lay on the scaffold for hours, half ignored amid the administrative shuffle, before it was buried in St. Peter ad Vincula between Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, a Protestant girl of 16 laid in the ground between 2 Howard queens. Her father followed her 11 days later, beheaded on Tower Hill for the rebellion that had killed her, and his story has a coda that nobody would dare invent. Nearly 3 centuries later, in the 1850s, a well-preserved severed head was found in a small vault at a church near the Tower called Holy Trinity Minories, a church with old connections to the Grey family. The head had apparently been packed in oak sawdust, and the tannin in the sawdust had preserved it, skin, features and, observers claimed, the marks of the axe, a first blow that had glanced and the cut that finished. For decades, Victorian and Edwardian visitors could ask the rector and be shown what was said to be the head of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, leathery and sunken but recognisably a face, in a box in a vestry. Identification of a 300-year-old head rests on tradition rather than paperwork. The head itself certainly existed. Plenty of respectable people described viewing it, and it was eventually buried in 1900 at St. Botolph's, Aldgate. Fathers who put teenage daughters on thrones did not end well in Tudor England, and in this one case you could, within living memory of our great-grandparents, go and look at exactly how it ended. I promised you we would come back to Margaret, the little girl whose father drowned behind a closed door in 1478, the woman who wore a barrel charm on her bracelet. Her whole life ran between the Tower's teeth. Her father executed there. Her brother, Edward of Warwick, a boy with a better claim to the throne than the Tudors, locked in the tower from age 10 and kept there so long and so closed off that people said he could not tell a goose from a capon, then beheaded at 24 on a pretext. Margaret herself survived by being useful, married safely, widowed and restored by Henry VIII, who made her Countess of Salisbury in her own right, one of only 2 women in the century to hold a peerage like that. She was governess to Princess Mary. She was, for a while, among the most honoured women in England, and she was the last of the Plantagenets, the old royal blood walking around in a devout, capable woman in her 60s. The blood is what killed her. Her son Reginald Pole, a cardinal safe on the continent, wrote a furious public attack on Henry's divorce and his church, and Henry could not reach the son, so he reached the mother. In 1538 the family was rounded up. 1 son was executed. Margaret, then about 65, was interrogated for days by professionals and gave them nothing. One of her examiners writing in something like admiration that they had dealt with one whom men might rather call a strong and constant man than a woman. No trial was ever held. Evidence was thin to the point of theatrical, the centrepiece a tunic supposedly found in her coffers embroidered with the arms of England, presented as proof she dreamed of the throne. Parliament attainted her, condemned without a hearing, and she went into the Tower and stayed there nearly 2.5 years, an old woman in cold stone rooms, so poorly provided that in the spring of 1541, the government's own accounts show an emergency order of clothing for her, a furred nightgown, petticoats, hose, shoes, because the Countess of Salisbury was freezing and nearly in rags. Somebody signed off on warm clothes for her in March or April. Somebody signed off on killing her weeks later. Both documents came from the same government. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, she was woken and told she would die within the hour. Her recorded reaction in the Imperial Ambassador Chapuis's dispatch was that she found the thing very strange, not knowing of what crime she was accused, nor how she had been sentenced. No scaffold had been built, a measure of how little ceremony was planned, just a low block set on the ground within the walls, and a small audience, the Lord Mayor of London and a group of officials, perhaps 150 people gathered around a 67-year-old woman at a lump of wood. She spent her last minutes asking those present to pray for the king, the queen, the young prince, and her former pupil Princess Mary, sending the girl her blessing. Then came the axe, and here the sources split, so you're getting both tellings. Chapuis, writing days after the event with informants in the city, reported that the Tower's regular executioner was away in the north, dealing with the aftermath of a rebellion, and the work had been left to a wretched and blundering youth. His words, garçonneau in the French, a wretched boy, who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. That sentence is the restrained, diplomatic version. An inexperienced boy handed a heavy axe and an elderly woman, missing the neck, striking the skull, the shoulders, the back, again and again, until the head and shoulders were, in the words of a professional diplomat choosing his language for an emperor, in pieces. The blows have been counted at 10 or 11 in later repetitions. Chapuis gave no number. He apparently felt pieces covered it. The second telling arrived later in the century and grew in the telling. In this version, Margaret refused to cooperate entirely. Told to lay her head on the block, she answered, So should traitors do, and I am none, and would not kneel. And the boy with the axe struck at her where she stood, and she turned her head from side to side, or in the fullest versions physically ran. An old woman scrambling around the yard with the executioner chasing and hacking at her, blood across the grass. 11 blows before she stopped moving. No witness wrote that scene down at the time. It surfaces decades on in works hostile to Henry, and historians generally trust Chapuis's nearer, plainer account, a clumsy boy and a mangled killing at the block over the chase. And yet the two versions agree on the only fact that matters to Margaret Pole, that she did not die at a stroke, that the last thing she experienced on this earth was an amateur cutting her apart by trial and error in front of the Lord Mayor of London. When word reached her son the Cardinal, he told his secretary he was now the son of a martyr, and then went to pray alone. The Catholic Church eventually beatified her. Henry, as far as any record shows, never mentioned her again. 5 years later, in the last year of Henry's life, the Tower did something it had never done before and never did again, and the victim was a 25-year-old gentlewoman from Lincolnshire. Anne Askew had been thrown out by her Catholic husband for her loud, learned Protestant convictions, had come to London, connected with reformist women around the new Queen, Catherine Parr, and had been arrested for denying that the communion bread became the body of Christ. That was heresy, and heresy burned. But the men running the interrogation, Lord Chancellor Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich, wanted more than one preacher. They wanted names, specifically the names of noble women in the Queen's own circle, because bringing down Catherine Parr herself was the real game. Anne would not give names. So in the summer of 1546 they moved her from Newgate to the Tower, and what happened next was illegal by every rule the Tower itself operated under. Racking a condemned person served no judicial purpose. She was already sentenced. Racking a woman was without precedent, considered beyond the line even by the men who signed torture warrants for a living. They did it anyway. She wrote it down. Her own account survives, composed in Newgate afterward and smuggled out to be printed abroad. So we have the rack described by the person on it. Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my opinion, and thereon they kept me a long time, and because I lay still and did not cry, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead, because I lay still and did not cry. The Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Anthony Knivet, had ordered the racking stopped at the customary point, and when Wriothesley demanded she be stretched again, Knivet refused outright, and the Lord Chancellor of England and the King's Counsellor took off their gowns, rolled their sleeves, and worked the wheels personally, two of the most senior men in the government straining at the levers of a rack with a young woman on it. Knivet left the room, took a boat upriver, and got to the king first to report what was being done in his tower, and beg pardon for having permitted any of it. Henry pardoned Knivet. No one was ever punished for the racking. By the time they lifted her off, her shoulders and hips were pulled from their sockets, her elbows and knees ruined. Sounds carry in that fortress, and one detail from the accounts places her screams precisely. The lieutenant's wife and daughter were walking in the garden by the White Tower during the session, heard what was happening below, and fled indoors. Anne fainted on the rack, was revived, and by her own account then sat 2 long hours on the bare floor, dislocated, debating theology with the Lord Chancellor, where he with many flattering words persuaded me to leave my opinion. She held it. She could never walk again. On the 16th of July 1546, they took her to Smithfield to burn, and she had to be carried the whole way in a chair, and at the stake the problem continued. A woman who cannot stand cannot be chained standing to a post. So they attached a seat to the stake and burned her sitting down, chained at the ankles, the knees, the waist, the chest and the neck to hold the slack body upright in the fire. 3 men burned with her. A bag of gunpowder was hung at each of their necks, framed as mercy. An explosion to shorten the burning, and the crowd of dignitaries watching from benches by St. Bartholomew's Gate flinched at the bangs. Before the torch went in, she was offered, one last time, the king's pardon if she would recant. Her answer, as reported, was that she came not thither to deny her lord and master. She was 25 years old, and the only woman the Tower of London's rack is known ever to have taken. Elizabeth's reign changed the Tower's clientele. The rack stayed busy, busier than under her father by the count of surviving warrants. Only now the men strapped to it were mostly Catholic priests, smuggled into England from seminaries abroad, hunted through the countryside by professional priest-catchers, and hauled to the Tower to be asked, with the levers, where the others were hiding. The state called them traitors. They called themselves missionaries. Whichever word you prefer, what was done to their bodies in that fortress is documented in detail, sometimes by the men themselves, and this stretch of the story contains the single best inside account of the Tower's torture chambers ever put on paper. Edmund Campion first. He had been the ornament of Oxford, a scholar so brilliant that Elizabeth herself had marked him out as a young man, and he threw it all away, went abroad, became a Jesuit, and slipped back into England in 1580 to minister to Catholics in secret. The government hunted him for a year, betrayed at a country house called Lyford Grange, found in a hiding hole over a gateway after a 2-day search. He was brought to London trussed on horseback with his elbows tied behind him and his feet lashed under the horse's belly, and a paper pinned to his hat for the crowds along the way. Campion, the seditious Jesuit. At the Tower, he went first into Little Ease, the 4-foot cube, folded over his knees in the dark for days. Then, an odd interlude. He was taken secretly at night to meet the Queen herself, who is said to have offered him wealth and advancement if he would simply conform. He would not. So the warrants were signed, and Campion went to the rack, and by the reckoning of the time he went 3 times across his months in the Tower, with sessions severe enough that the government felt obliged to publish a pamphlet insisting he had been racked only gently. His own reported answer, when a visitor asked how he felt the day after a session, was, "Not ill, because not at all, a scholar's joke made through dislocated shoulders." Claims circulated among Catholics that needles had been driven under his fingernails as well. When he was finally brought to trial in Westminster Hall in November 1581 and required to raise his right hand to enter his plea, he could not lift the arm. A fellow prisoner raised it for him, kissing his hand first. The verdict was arranged, and on the 1st of December 1581, Campion was dragged on a hurdle through the mud to Tyburn and given the full traitor's death I described earlier, hanged, cut down and butchered, though in his case the crowd's mood ran so uneasy that he was left hanging until he was dead, or nearly so before the knives started. Something happened at that quartering that kept the horror moving down the years. As the executioner tore Campion's body apart, blood sprayed the nearest spectators, and among them stood a young gentleman poet named Henry Walpole, a curious onlooker, splashed across his coat. Walpole later wrote that the moment changed his life. He went abroad, became a Jesuit himself, came back to England in 1593, and was captured within a day of landing. In the Tower, Walpole fell into the hands of Richard Topcliffe, and Topcliffe deserves his own sentence here, the Queen's own priest-hunter, a man so enthusiastic about torture that he was licensed to keep instruments at his private house, and boasted of a rack of his own devising, and whose surviving letters about his work have a relish to them that unsettled even his colleagues. Walpole was tortured, by the accounts of his order, 14 separate times, hung in the manacles until his fingers were left permanently damaged, so damaged he could no longer write properly, a poet whose hands were destroyed. He was executed at York in 1595, the same death as Campion, whose blood had recruited him, now the manacles themselves from the inside. John Gerard was a Jesuit built like the country gentleman he was born, a tall outdoorsman who moved through England disguised as a gambling, hawking man of fashion, and he evaded capture for 6 years before they got him. In April 1597, he was transferred to the Tower, and the examiners wanted one thing from him: the location of Father Henry Garnet, head of the Jesuit mission. Gerard's autobiography, written later for his order, walks us through what followed almost hour by hour. He describes being taken in a procession, warders carrying candles, to the torture room, a place of immense extent, he wrote, in semi-darkness, with every device and instrument of torture ranged along the walls, and part of the theatre was exactly that, the walk past the machinery, the candlelight on the iron, letting the prisoner's imagination begin the work. They pointed the devices out to him as they passed. Then, his own words, as close to verbatim as translation allows. They put my wrists into iron gauntlets and ordered me to climb 2 or 3 wicker steps. My arms were then lifted up and an iron bar was passed through the rings of one gauntlet, then through the staple and rings of the second gauntlet. This done, they fastened the bar with a pin to prevent it slipping, and then, removing the wicker steps one by one from under my feet, they left me hanging by my hands and arms fastened above my head. His toes could just brush the floor, so they dug the earth away beneath them, and this is what hanging by the wrists actually does. All the blood in my body seemed to rush up into my arms and hands, he wrote, and I thought that blood was oozing from the ends of my fingers and the pores of my skin. But it was only a sensation caused by my flesh swelling above the irons holding them. The pain was so intense that I thought I could not possibly endure it. The chest compresses. Breathing becomes labor. The shoulder joints take the full weight of the body hour upon hour, and Gerard hung like that through repeated sessions, fainting 8 or 9 times in a single day by his own count, and each time he fainted, the warders held him up or put the steps back until he revived, and then took the steps away again. A man supervising the sessions told him plainly he would be hung there day after day until he talked, and Gerard records his own answer, that he trusted in God, and the thing he says he prayed for in the worst of it was not rescue. He prayed for the strength to die rather than name anyone. He named no one. Afterward, his hands were so swollen and nerve-damaged that for 3 weeks his jailer had to cut his food for him and dress him, feeding a grown man like an infant. And here the story takes a turn nobody in that fortress saw coming. The jailer, doing those small kindnesses daily, grew fond of his prisoner. Gerard, recovering, began sending letters to friends outside, ostensibly innocent notes written in charcoal, with the real messages between the lines in orange juice, invisible until warmed. Through those letters, across months, an escape was organized, and on an October night in 1597, John Gerard and a fellow prisoner got onto the roof of the Cradle Tower above the moat and caught a rope thrown up from a boat below, and Gerard, whose hands were still wrecked from the manacles, went out along that rope over the water. Part way across, his grip failed. He hung there over the moat, unable to pull further, his mangled fingers giving out, and by his own account he hung and swung until, somehow, inch by inch, he worked himself the rest of the way and was hauled into the boat more dead than alive. He got clean away, one of the very few in the tower's history. And he did one more thing before vanishing. He arranged horses and money so his jailer could flee too, that same night, because once the escape was discovered, the man would have been destroyed for the kindness he had shown. Gerard worked in hiding in England for 9 more years, escaped abroad after the Gunpowder Plot, and died in Rome in 1637, an old man of 73 who had once hung by his wrists in the dark under the White Tower and beaten the place. Most got no rope and no boat, and what they left instead is still on the walls. The Beauchamp Tower and the Salt Tower are covered, floor to shoulder height, in prisoners' carvings, hundreds of them, names, dates, coats of arms, prayers, cut into the stone with whatever came to hand across weeks and months of empty time. And walking through those rooms today is the closest the tower comes to speaking. Thomas Mier's lines about torture, strange, we've already met. In the Beauchamp Tower, the grandest carving belongs to the Dudley brothers, the 5 sons of the Duke of Northumberland, all imprisoned together after their father's scheme crowned and killed Jane Grey, and one of them, John, carved a large panel, the family bear and staff wreathed in a border of flowers, each flower a brother in code, roses for Ambrose, gillyflowers for Guildford, the boy who died an hour before Jane, oak leaves for Robert, who would live to become Elizabeth's beloved Leicester, honeysuckle for Henry. John Dudley finished his carving, was eventually released, and died within days of walking free, his health broken by the imprisonment. So the stone panel is effectively his tomb inscription, cut by his own hand in advance. In the Salt Tower, low on the wall, sits the strangest carving in the fortress. Hugh Draper was an innkeeper from Bristol, locked up in 1560 on an accusation of sorcery, of practicing magic against a courtier's wife. The record notes him as very sick. On the wall of his cell he carved with obvious labor and obvious skill a large and precise astrological sphere, the zodiac ringed around a globe with a square chart beside it for casting horoscopes, and beneath it the inscription, "Hugh Draper of Bristow, made this sphere the 30th day of May, anno 1561. A man accused of sorcery, awaiting judgment, spent his confinement carving an instrument of astrology into the wall of a royal prison, either the most defiant act in the building's history or the work of a sick man ordering the heavens because nothing on earth was in his power anymore. The carving sits oddly low, and people who study it have suggested he worked sitting or lying on the floor, too weak to stand at the wall. After the carving, Hugh Draper disappears from the records completely. No release was ever recorded, and no burial either, just the sphere. One more carving from those walls marks the longest sentence the Tower ever imposed without an execution. Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, the premier Earl of England, converted to Catholicism, tried to flee abroad, and was locked in the Beauchamp Tower in 1585. He stayed 10 years. His wife was pregnant when he was taken, and the son she bore he never once saw, because the one concession he begged for at the end, dying, was to see his wife and the boy. And the answer that came back was that he could see them and be released and restored to his honours the moment he attended a single Protestant service. One church service against his wife, his child, his freedom, and his life. He refused and died in his cell in October 1595, aged 38, of dysentery after months of wasting illness, with a persistent rumour, never resolved, that his food had been helped along with poison. Above the fireplace of his room he had carved a Latin sentence, still there today, and translated it says, "The more affliction we endure for Christ in this world, the more glory we shall gain with Christ in the world to come." He had 10 years to get the lettering right. From those same Catholic prisoners comes the Tower's most repeated horror story. Their writings speak of a cell they called the dungeon among the rats, a chamber below the high water line of the Thames, in total darkness, into which the tide seeped twice a day, and with the water came the river rats, swarming up out of the drains into the black, and a prisoner chained or merely trapped in that cell would spend the night defending his own body from them, or failing to. Accounts speak of men bitten as they slept, of flesh gnawed, of prisoners found with wounds they could not see to bind. The Tower's own administrative records never name such a cell. The descriptions come from the prisoners' side, from men with every reason to record their persecution at its darkest, and Victorian novelists later took the dungeon up with enthusiasm, which has muddied the trail further. What nobody disputes is that the fortress had subterranean chambers below river level, that the Thames got into them, and that London's rats went where the water went. Whether a specific cell was used the way the accounts describe, the records leave you to weigh for yourself. The men who wrote about it believed it, and some of them claimed the scars. Elizabeth's own reign closed its account at the Tower, with the last beheading ever carried out on the private green, and it belonged to the man she loved most and trusted least. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was the old Queen's final favourite, 30 years her junior, glamorous, petulant, and increasingly unmanageable, and in February 1601 he tipped over from sulking into open revolt, marching through London with 200 armed followers, expecting the city to rise for him. The city stayed indoors. Within hours he was besieged in his own house, and within days he was in the Tower, tried and condemned, and Elizabeth, after signing and hesitating and signing again, let the sentence stand, granting him only privacy, death inside the walls rather than in front of the Tower Hill mob, partly, people said, because nobody could predict what a London crowd might do at the killing of a man they had cheered for years. On the 25th of February 1601, Essex came out to a scaffold on the green wearing a black velvet gown over a scarlet waistcoat, so that when the gown came off he stood dressed in the colour of blood, deliberately, ready. He confessed at length, prayed at length, forgave the executioner, and lay flat over the low block with his arms spread. The axe took 3 strokes to sever his head, the first of them, by the witnesses' accounts, landing while his lips were still moving through a psalm, and the executioner had to be smuggled away from the Tower afterward, because the crowds outside had heard how it went and wanted to tear him apart. The man swinging that axe carries a footnote odd enough to survive 4 centuries. His name was Thomas Derrick, and years earlier he had been condemned for a crime at Cadiz, and the commander who held his pardon in his hands, who spared his life on condition he take up the hangman's trade nobody else would touch, was the Earl of Essex. Derrick lived because Essex pardoned him, and Essex died under Derrick's axe. 3 bad strokes from a man whose life he had personally saved. Derrick went on to hang so many men at Tyburn, some 3,000 by the boast attached to his name, and to rig his gallows rope with such trademark efficiency that his surname detached itself from him and fastened onto the lifting apparatus he resembled, and every crane called a derrick on every dock and oil field in the world today is named after the man who botched the Earl of Essex. One more thread from that morning refuses to die, the story of the ring, that Elizabeth had once given Essex a ring to send back to her if ever his life stood in danger, that he entrusted it from the Tower to a messenger, that it went astray in the hands of an enemy, and that the Queen, never receiving it, let him die believing he was too proud to ask. The tale surfaces well after both of them were dead, and a candidate ring sits in a museum case to this day, and whether you believe it will depend on how much cruelty you think coincidence is capable of. Elizabeth outlived him by 2 years and, by the accounts of her final months, never really recovered. Elizabeth died in 1603. The Scottish King James came south, and within 3 years the Tower staged the most famous interrogation in its history, over a plot that came within one nervous informant of killing the entire English government in a single second. The scheme was simple and enormous. A group of Catholic gentlemen, despairing of relief under the new king, rented a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords and filled it with 36 barrels of gunpowder, close to a ton of it, hidden under firewood, enough by modern calculation to have levelled the chamber and everything near it. On the 5th of November 1605, at the state opening of Parliament, the king, his heir, the lords, the commons, the judges and the bishops would all be sitting on top of it, and one man would be in the cellar with a watch and a slow match. That man, found there around midnight on the 4th in the final search, booted and spurred for his getaway, with the touchwood on him, gave his name as John Johnson, and when the astonished councillors asked what he had intended with so much powder, he answered, by the account of those present, that he had meant to blow the Scots back to Scotland. Face to face with the king himself in the royal bedchamber that night, hauled in for James to look at, he stayed contemptuous, expressing regret only that the thing had failed. His real name was Guy Fawkes, a Yorkshire soldier who had spent a decade fighting for Spain in the Low Countries, the plotter's explosives man. James sent him to the Tower with written instructions that survive in the king's own hand, and one sentence of them, quoted exactly, is a monarch personally prescribing a torture schedule. The gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, James wrote, et sic per gradus ad ima tenditur, and so on step by step to the worst. The gentler tortures meant the manacles, and by tradition the first days went to little ease as well. Fawkes hung by his wrists and gave nothing but his false name and jokes. Step by step meant the rack, and although the warrant trail for the rack itself is incomplete, what happened to Guy Fawkes over the following days is written in the most unsettling pair of documents the Tower era produced, his own signatures. On his early examination papers, the signature says Guido Fawkes in a firm, practiced soldier's hand, confident strokes, a man in control of a pen. On the confession dated the 9th of November, after the interrogations had run their course, the signature is a faint, broken scrawl, the letters collapsing into each other, trailing off after Guido as though the hand could not finish the surname, and the ink pressure so weak it barely marks the page. You can find images of both signatures in about 10 seconds online, and side by side they say more than any description manages. Something was done to that man between the two documents that took away his ability to hold a pen, and the damage points to the rack. Wrenched shoulders, torn wrists, fingers that no longer answered. He confessed everything and named the others only after learning they were already taken or dead. The plotters who fled were run down at a house in Staffordshire where, in a detail almost too neat, their spilled gunpowder, laid out to dry before a fire, caught a spark and burned several of them before the siege even began, blinding one and maiming others, their own powder getting them first. The survivors were shot or captured, and 8 men stood trial in Westminster Hall in January 1606, Fawkes among them, the verdict a formality, the sentence the full one. They died across 2 days in 2 batches, and the details of those 2 mornings show you the entire range of what that sentence could be. On the 30th of January, at the west end of St. Paul's Churchyard, Sir Everard Digby, the youngest and best liked of them, a handsome man of 27, went first, and the executioners cut him down fast, too fast, fully conscious for the knife, and a story attached itself to his death within a generation and has never let go, that when the executioner tore out his heart and held it up with the customary cry, "Behold the heart of a traitor," Digby's severed head answered, "Thou liest." The story surfaces in print decades later rather than in any eyewitness dispatch, and what a severed head can and cannot manage you may settle with your own physician. But everyone present had watched a man alive and aware through his own butchering, and the story gave that fact a voice. Robert Wintour and John Grant died after him the same morning. Grant blinded and burned from the powder accident, and Thomas Bates, the servant, last. The next day, the 31st of January 1606, the remaining four were dragged on hurdles to Old Palace Yard at Westminster, deliberately, to die in sight of the building they had meant to destroy. Thomas Wintour went up first and was butchered after only a brief hanging. Ambrose Rookwood asked the crowd's prayers. Robert Keyes did something desperate. When the hangman turned him off the ladder, Keyes leapt outward with all his force, trying to snap his own neck and cheat the knives, and the rope broke. He fell to the scaffold alive and uninjured enough, and they picked him up and took him straight to the block, and the disemboweling, fully sensible, his one gamble spent. Guy Fawkes came last, and by then the tortures and months in a cell had wrecked him so thoroughly that he could barely stand. Contemporaries recording that he was scarce able to go up the ladder, the hangman having to help him climb, an odd courtesy, assisting a man up to his own noose. At the top, weak as he was, Fawkes managed the same move Keyes had tried. He jumped, or by some accounts fell, from the top of the ladder, and his rope held, and the drop broke his neck cleanly. He hung dead while the crowd waited, and everything that followed, the castration, the opening of the belly, the quartering, was performed on a corpse. The government took its 4 pieces anyway and posted them to the corners of the kingdom, and his head went up. But Guy Fawkes felt none of it. The only man of the 13 to genuinely escape the sentence by 6 feet of rope and 1 act of timing. One more death closed the affair, months later, and the crowd itself decided how it went. Father Henry Garnet, the Jesuit superior John Gerard had hung in the manacles to protect, was convicted of foreknowledge of the plot through the confessional, a conviction argued about from that day to this, and executed in St. Paul's churchyard in May 1606. As he was pushed off the ladder, spectators surged forward and hung onto his legs, dragging down with their weight to snap his neck and kill him quickly, and the crowd's mood was so plainly against a live butchering that the officials let him hang until dead before the knives did their work. Londoners came to watch these things, and sometimes, evidently, they came to edit them. Afterward, among the relic-minded, a husk of straw from the scaffold basket, flecked with a drop of Garnet's blood, became famous, believers claiming the drop had formed a tiny perfect image of his face. Garnet's straw, examined, denounced, smuggled abroad, and eventually lost. A single blood-stained stalk of straw treated as the last portrait of a hanged priest. 7 years after the plot, the Tower hosted a murder rather than an execution, committed by remote control over 5 months, and the victim died by inches in a locked room while the people feeding him killed him meal by meal. The Overbury affair is the closest thing the Tower has to a true crime story in the modern style, complete with a glamorous couple, hired help, a botched cover-up, and a trial that scandalized the country. Sir Thomas Overbury was a poet and the indispensable brain behind Robert Carr, the beautiful, dim young Scot who had become King James's favourite and risen to an earldom on the strength of his face. Carr fell for Frances Howard, Countess of Essex, one of the great beauties of the court and a member of the most predatory family in England, and she wanted to marry him, needing first to annul her existing marriage, and the annulment case, which turned on the claim that her marriage had never been consummated, was already the filthiest gossip in London. Overbury opposed the match with everything he had, telling Carr to his face, by the accounts that surfaced later, that the woman was noted for her injury and immodesty, and worse words than those. Frances Howard heard about all of it. Overbury knew too much, talked too well, and stood in the doorway of her future. The trap was elegant. Overbury was offered a prestigious ambassadorship abroad, and Carr, playing his part, privately advised his friend to refuse it, promising to square things with the king. Overbury refused. Refusing a royal appointment was contempt, and in April 1613, James sent him to the Tower, supposedly to cool off for a few weeks. The few weeks were the point. Within days, the lieutenant of the Tower was replaced with a compliant man, Sir Gervase Elwes, who owed his new job to the Howard interest, and a new underkeeper named Richard Weston was assigned on recommendation to wait personally on Overbury. Weston came recommended by Mrs. Anne Turner, a doctor's widow, court dressmaker, keeper of fashionable secrets, and Frances Howard's confidant, and through Turner ran the supply line, an apothecary named James Franklin, who later stood in court and listed what he had provided: white arsenic, aqua fortis, mercury sublimate, powder of diamonds, great spiders, cantharides, 7 poisons by his own count, chosen and rotated so the death would look like lingering disease. For 5 months, Overbury's food arrived seasoned. Tarts and jellies came in as gifts, and Elwes later admitted seeing them go bad in the pantry, black, foul, unfit, and quietly substituting clean ones on some days, so that even the cover-up had a cover-up, the lieutenant simultaneously enabling the murder and rationing it. Overbury sickened, rallied, sickened again. He vomited constantly. Ulcers opened on his body. He wasted until the flesh hung off him, writing increasingly desperate letters to Carr, his supposed friend, begging him to hurry the release, unaware the man opening them was engaged to the woman poisoning him. His constitution was remarkable, and that was the problem. Month after month, the doses that should have finished him only tortured him, and Frances Howard's wedding was waiting on his grave. In September, the conspirators stopped being patient. An apothecary's assistant was paid £20 to administer, in the guise of treatment, an enema of corrosive sublimate of mercury, on the 14th of September 1613, and mercury sublimate introduced that way burns through the intestines, and Thomas Overbury spent his final hours in a state the trial record leaves largely to the imagination, dying between 5 and 6 the next morning. The jailers who laid him out described a body ulcerated all over, a great yellow blister on his back, the belly discoloured, and a stench so overwhelming that the inquest was cursory, and the burial arranged that same day, within hours, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, before anyone could look too closely. 3 months later, Frances Howard, her annulment granted, married Robert Carr in the wedding of the season, wearing her hair loose as a bride. The truth surfaced the way these things do, sideways. 2 years on, the apothecary's boy, sick in Flushing and thinking himself dying, unburdened his conscience about the £20 and the enema, and the confession travelled back to England and landed on the desk of a state that had its own reasons for wanting Carr gone. The investigation, run publicly by the great lawyer Sir Edward Coke, tore the court open. Weston was tried first, hanged at Tyburn. Anne Turner followed, and her execution had a piece of theatre attached. She had made fashionable the yellow starch that coloured the extravagant ruffs of the court, and the judge ordered that she die wearing her yellow ruffs, and the hangman, for mockery, wore yellow bands and cuffs of his own, and the fashion for yellow starch died on that gallows with her. Sir Gervase Elwes, the lieutenant who had watched it all happen in his own fortress, was hanged on Tower Hill, in sight of the walls he had disgraced. Franklin the apothecary followed, then the headline trials, and the great couple were both convicted of murder, Francis confessing, Carr protesting innocence to the end, and both were condemned to death. And neither died. James pardoned them. They were held in the Tower for 6 years. And here the building added its own flourish. Frances Howard was lodged, whether by carelessness or by somebody's exquisite sense of humour, in the same quarters where Overbury had died, and was reported to have become hysterical on learning it. The couple were released in 1622 to a shared internal exile, by then despising each other, and Frances died 10 years later, at 39, of an illness of the womb so agonizing and disfiguring that pamphleteers wrote it up as heaven's own sentence, delivered late. While the Overbury conspirators were still measuring doses, another prisoner a few towers away was dying with no conspiracy required, only neglect and a broken heart, and her story is the quietest tragedy in the whole fortress. Arbella Stuart was King James's first cousin, royal blood close enough to the throne that her existence was itself a security problem, and she had spent her entire life supervised, unmarried by policy, forbidden to make the one alliance that could turn her into a threat. At 34 she defied all of it, and secretly married William Seymour, a man 12 years younger who carried his own drop of royal claim, exactly the combination the state feared most. When it came out, the couple were separated and confined, and in 1611 they attempted a double escape, romantic and doomed. Arbella disguised herself as a man, doublet, breeches, boots, a rapier at her side, and rowed for the coast to a waiting French ship. Seymour broke out of the Tower itself, disguised as a workman, following a cart out of the gates. He made it to the continent. She did not. Her ship, lingering off Calais against advice because she would not sail without word of him, was overtaken, and Arbella was brought back and put into the Tower her husband had just escaped from, and the two of them, married a year, never saw each other again. She was given no trial, because she had committed no crime a court could name. Marrying without permission was not treason, so she was simply held indefinitely at the king's pleasure, and the confinement was made strict, her walks curtailed, her household controlled. For 4 years her letters trace the descent, from confident appeals to bewildered pleading, to silence. She stopped eating. Whether it began as protest or despair, or the disease of the mind her enemies were quick to allege, the outcome ran the same course. She refused food and refused physicians, lying in her chamber in the tower while her body consumed itself, and on the 25th of September 1615, she died there, 39 years old. The state, ever alert to rumour, ordered a post-mortem to rule out poison, and the report survives: no poison. A body wasted by a chronic and long sickness, ulcerated bed sores from months lying down, and extreme leanness, the clinical phrase for a woman who had starved to death in a royal fortress with kitchens 100 yards away. They buried her at night, without ceremony, in Westminster Abbey, and the grave assignment carries its own cold poetry. Her coffin was placed directly on top of the coffin of Mary, Queen of Scots, one inconvenient royal woman stacked upon another, and no monument was raised over either name for years. Sharing the fortress with Arbella through those same years was the Tower's most famous long-term resident, and his story shows the other face of imprisonment there, the gilded version, right up until it didn't. Sir Walter Raleigh, soldier, explorer, poet, favourite of the old Queen, was convicted of treason in 1603, on evidence so thin, his own trial judge later said the justice of England had never been so degraded, and he was reprieved on the scaffold's edge and stowed in the bloody Tower instead, where he stayed 13 years. Raleigh's captivity was the aristocratic package. His wife Bess moved in. His servants attended him. He converted a shed against the wall into a laboratory and brewed cordials and medicines that fashionable London bought. He grew exotic plants in a small garden. He received the heir to the throne, Prince Henry, as a regular visitor, the boy famously remarking that no king but his father would keep such a bird in a cage. A son, Carew, was conceived inside the fortress and christened in the chapel where the headless queens lay under the floor, a baptism held over that particular ground. And Raleigh wrote, hugely, producing his history of the world in a cell, 1,000,000 words beginning at the creation, and never getting past ancient Rome, because 13 years was not enough time to bring the story up to the people who had imprisoned him. Even the gilded version corrodes a man. Raleigh suffered a stroke in the Tower, his health sliding year over year, and in 1616 he talked his way out with one last promise, a gold mine he claimed to know on the Orinoco in Guyana, to be taken without touching Spanish territory or Spanish blood, on pain of his suspended death sentence. The expedition was a catastrophe. Fever gutted the crews, the mine never materialized, and a detachment including Raleigh's own son Wat attacked a Spanish settlement against the explicit terms, and Wat was killed in the fighting, run through at the front of a charge. Raleigh, waiting downriver, learned in one dispatch that his son was dead and his own life was forfeit. He wrote to Bess that his brains were broken. Back in England, the old sentence from 1603 was reactivated, no new trial needed, and on the 29th of October 1618, in Old Palace Yard at Westminster, not the Tower, Raleigh gave the scaffold performance of the century. Shivering slightly from his fever, he asked to feel the axe, ran his thumb along the edge, and smiled. "This is a sharp medicine," he said, "but it is a physician for all diseases." Refusing a blindfold, asked which way he would lay his head. He answered that so the heart be right, it is no matter which way the head lieth. The headsman hesitated, unnerved, and Raleigh's last words were an order. "What dost thou fear? Strike, man, strike." 2 blows took the head, and the crowd unusually groaned rather than cheered. Then the strangest afterlife of any head in this story, Bess Raleigh claimed it, had it embalmed and kept it in a red velvet bag for the remaining 29 years of her life, by every account carrying it with her when she travelled, and their son Carew, the boy christened in the Tower, is said to have kept it after her, so that Walter Raleigh's head remained a member of the family for decades after his body went into the ground at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The century's one genuinely funny Tower story arrives in 1671. And even this one opens with an old man being beaten half to death. So calibrate your expectations. Colonel Thomas Blood was an Irish adventurer, ex-soldier, serial conspirator, a man with a face John Evelyn described as villainous and unmerciful, well-spoken and dangerously insinuating. In the spring of 1671, Blood, dressed as a parson, complete with cassock and a woman posing as his wife, began cultivating Talbot Edwards, the 77-year-old keeper of the jewel house, who lived over the jewels and showed them to paying visitors. The fake parson's fake wife staged a stomach ailment on the first visit. Mrs. Edwards nursed her. Gifts followed, gloves were sent, friendship bloomed over weeks, and Blood eventually proposed a marriage between his invented nephew and the Edwards' daughter. On the 9th of May, the parson arrived at 7 in the morning with the nephew and 2 friends, asking to show them the jewels while they waited for breakfast. In the jewel room, they threw a cloak over old Edwards's head, gagged him with a wooden plug, and told him to stay quiet. He would not stay quiet, so they beat him down with a mallet, and when he kept struggling under the hood, they stabbed him. An elderly man mallet-struck and run through on his own floor, and left him for dead among his display cases. Then, the part every tour guide loves, Blood took the mallet to the regalia itself, hammering St. Edward's crown flat so it would fit under his cassock, while one accomplice stuffed the sovereign's orb down the front of his breeches, and another began filing the sceptre in half to bag it. Edwards's son chose that exact morning to return home from years of soldiering abroad, walked in on the aftermath, and his father, soaked in blood, got the gag out and began roaring treason. "The crown is stolen." The thieves ran for the wharf, firing at warders as they went, the flattened crown of England bouncing loose at one point and being scooped back up, and they were tackled and taken at the outer gate. Blood's response to capture set the tone for everything after. It was a gallant attempt, he reportedly said, however unsuccessful, for it was for a crown. He then refused to answer to anyone but the king personally, and against all sense, Charles II granted the audience, and after a private conversation nobody has ever fully explained, the king pardoned Blood entirely and gave him Irish lands worth £500 a year. Theories have run from royal amusement to Blood knowing dangerous secrets, to Charles having been privately in on it for the money. Old Talbot Edwards survived his wounds, received a reward he had trouble actually collecting, and spent his last years profitably telling visitors the story of the day he was nearly murdered for a hatful of flattened gold. He died in 1674. Blood infuriatingly died in his bed. 14 years after Blood's mallet, Tower Hill staged the worst beheading in its long career of them, and the man responsible already had form. Jack Ketch was the public executioner of London, and in 1683 he had made a horror of the beheading of Lord William Russell, taking 3 or 4 strokes over a job that should have taken 1, mangling the neck so badly that Ketch afterward published a printed apology, an actual pamphlet, in which he blamed the victim for flinching and himself for being distracted. The apology was still in living memory in July 1685, when Ketch's next aristocratic client climbed Tower Hill, and the client had certainly heard about Russell, because he brought it up. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was the eldest illegitimate son of Charles II, glamorous and adored by the Protestant crowds, and after his father's death, he had raised the West Country in rebellion against his Catholic uncle, James II. The rising died in the marshes at Sedgemoor, and Monmouth was found days later hiding in a ditch under bracken, dressed as a shepherd, unshaven and starving, with raw peas in his pocket. Brought to London, he abandoned every scrap of dignity in a bid to live, writing grovelling letters, and at a personal audience with the king, he crawled on his knees and wept, and his uncle, having granted the audience with no intention of granting mercy, watched him beg and sent him to the Tower. Some cruelty is in the granting of the interview at all. On the 15th of July 1685, Monmouth walked up Tower Hill through one of the largest crowds the place ever drew. On the scaffold, he was calm again. The panic burned off, and he did something no condemned man is supposed to do. He engaged his executioner in a professional critique. He handed Ketch 6 guineas, promising more from a servant if the work was clean, and said, "Here are 6 guineas for you. Pray do your business well. Do not serve me as you did my Lord Russell. I have heard you struck him 3 or 4 times. Then he touched the edge of the axe and told Ketch he feared it was not sharp enough. Bystanders reported Ketch visibly rattled. A nervous headsman with a duke lecturing him and thousands watching, and the duke lay down, and the first blow proved him right. It gashed the back of the neck and skipped, and Monmouth, half severed, raised himself up on the block and turned his head around to look at Jack Ketch. No account records that he said anything. The look was apparently enough. Ketch struck again and again, each blow landing wrong on a moving, dying man, and after the 3rd or 4th, he threw the axe down entirely and cried out to the sheriffs, by the accounts of those nearest, "God damn me, I can do no more. My heart fails me." The sheriffs on the scaffold forced him to pick the axe up, the crowd now screaming, and he delivered more blows. The official Tower account settles on 5 in total. Spectators claimed 7 and 8, and at the end of all of them, the head still hung on by tissue, and Jack Ketch pulled a knife from his belt and finished the Duke of Monmouth the way a butcher finishes a carcass. The crowd surged so violently at the scaffold that Ketch was hustled away under guard, John Evelyn recording that the people would have torn him to pieces, and men and women pressed in to soak handkerchiefs in the Duke's blood, relics of a Protestant martyr in the making. A story has trailed after the burial ever since, that no proper portrait of Monmouth existed, so the head was stitched back onto the body and a likeness painted before he went under the chapel floor, and a painting sometimes identified as that corpse portrait has hung in national collections, eyes closed, a line at the throat. Galleries today catalogue the identification cautiously, and no document from 1685 orders any such sitting, so it stays filed among the tales the Tower generates. His body does lie in St. Peter ad Vincula, under the same stones as the Queen's. His uncle's revenge did not stop at one neck. Through the autumn of 1685, Judge George Jeffreys took the assize courts through the rebel West Country in what everyone immediately called the Bloody Assizes, hundreds hanged, and the sentence for treason being what it was, the region's market towns spent that winter decorated with boiled, tarred quarters of local men, nailed to church towers and market crosses, deliberately distributed so that no community that had risen would lack its own display, and contemporaries wrote about the smell along the roads. Jeffreys got the Lord Chancellorship for it. 3 years later, James II's regime collapsed, and Jeffreys, attempting to flee the country disguised as a sailor, was recognized in a whopping alehouse by a survivor of his own courtroom in one telling, and the mob nearly killed him on the spot. He was taken to the Tower, officially for his own protection, and the hanging judge of the Bloody Assizes died there in April 1689 of long-standing kidney disease, in pain, subsisting toward the end, the story goes, on brandy and oysters, a prisoner in the fortress that had received so many of his victims. The Tower's last great generation of the axe belonged to the Jacobites, the lords who kept rising for the exiled Stuarts, and their era gives us one perfect escape and one unforgettable exit. The escape first. In 1716, following the failed rising of the year before, Lord Nithsdale sat in the Tower awaiting beheading, scheduled for the morning of the 24th of February. On the evening of the 23rd, his wife Winifred visited, accompanied by several ladies, and executed a plan she had built entirely out of clothing and nerve. Her friends wore extra layers. Inside the cell, they dressed Lord Nithsdale in a woman's riding hood and cloak, painted his cheeks with rouge, whitened his heavy eyebrows, wrapped his chin against the stubble as though weeping into a handkerchief, and Lady Nithsdale walked her husband out past the guards as a distraught female visitor, loudly addressing him as her maid Evans, and lamenting, while Confederates came and went to confuse the count of women. Then, the touch that elevates the whole thing, she went back into the empty cell and held a conversation with nobody, answering herself in a lowered voice, so the guards outside heard a couple's murmured farewells before leaving and telling the sentries her husband was at his prayers and should not be disturbed. By the time the tower understood it was guarding an empty room, Nithsdale was hidden in London, and he eventually crossed to Europe in the livery of the Venetian ambassador's servants. King George, informed, reportedly remarked, "It was the best thing a man in his situation could have done." The couple reunited abroad and grew old together in Rome, just about the only story in this entire video that ends with a living couple. The unforgettable exit came a generation later and closed the era. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was an 80-year-old Highland chief with a lifetime of magnificent treachery behind him, a man who had changed sides so many times that both sides distrusted him on principle, and after the last Jacobite rising collapsed at Culloden, he was caught, brought south, tried before his peers, and sentenced to the axe. Lovat treated the entire process as entertainment. He was fat, gouty, had to be carried in a chair, and cracked jokes at his own trial. On the 9th of April 1747, Tower Hill filled with one of its vastest crowds ever. Spectator stands built and tickets sold, and before Lovat even reached the scaffold, one of the timber stands, overloaded with nearly 1,000 paying viewers, collapsed, killing spectators outright, the reports of the day counting the dead at around 9, some later accounts saying as many as 20 bodies pulled from the wreckage while the ceremony carried on nearby. Lovat, informed of the disaster, laughed and kept chuckling about it on the scaffold, remarking, in the phrase pinned to his memory ever after, "The more mischief, the better sport." People will tell you the expression "laughing your head off" descends from that morning, and the claim decorates 100 articles with nothing older than the 20th century behind it, so enjoy it as decoration. On the block, the old man was pure composure, felt the axe edge in the Raleigh manner, recited a line of Horace about how sweet it is to die for one's country, from him a joke with several layers, and died at a single clean stroke. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was the last man ever beheaded in Britain. The axe that had been working Tower Hill for 400 years, through Moore and Cromwell and Monmouth, retired on an 80-year-old who found the whole thing funny, on a morning when the scaffolding killed more people than the executioner did. The block they cut for that morning was never used again, and it survives. It sits today in the White Tower, beside a headsman's axe, plain oak, scooped on both sides to take the shoulders and the chin, the marks still in it, and blocks were carpentered fresh to order for each client, like coffins, so this one belonged to Lovat alone. 400 years of the trade on that hill, and the single piece of working equipment the tower kept from all of it belongs to the very last customer. Before we close out the 18th century, two later prisoners show what the place had become. In 1780, the tower received the only American ever held within its walls as a state prisoner, And he was no minor catch. Henry Laurens of South Carolina, a former president of the Continental Congress, captured at sea on a diplomatic mission to Holland, with his papers imperfectly sunk, since the weighted bag was fished back out of the water by a quick British sailor. Laurens spent some 15 months in the Tower, charged on suspicion of high treason, writing complaints about the cost. Because the old system still ran and this Republican revolutionary was being billed for his own imprisonment, warders' fees and lodging, an invoice from the ancient machine. His health broke down badly inside those walls, and he was eventually released and exchanged, man, for a British prisoner of some standing, General Lord Cornwallis, lately surrendered at Yorktown, one president for one general, and Laurens went on to help negotiate the peace that ended the war. That same decade, Lord George Gordon, whose name attached itself to the riots that burned half London in 1780, sat in the Tower for months, awaiting a treason trial while the city smouldered, and walked free when a jury acquitted him. Proof that by then, at last, the verdicts inside English courtrooms had stopped being arranged in advance quite so reliably. With the axe retired, this feels like the right moment for the part of the Tower's cruelty that never made the chronicles: the waiting. For every prisoner who died on a scaffold, the fortress held dozens who simply endured it, and the endurance was its own sentence. Arrival usually came by water, through the river entrance under St. Thomas's Tower that everyone learned to call Traitor's Gate, and prisoners wrote about that passage more than almost anything else. The barge sliding out of daylight into the arch, the portcullis, the green smell of the river trapped under stone, and the understanding, at the exact moment the light changed, of what the odds now were. Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, brought in under suspicion by her sister Mary in 1554, sat down on the wet landing stairs in the rain and refused to go further, saying, "Here landeth as true a subject as ever landed at these stairs," and her own gentleman usher broke down crying, and the 20-year-old told him off for it, since he ought to be comforting her. She, famously, walked back out. Most of the people in this video went through that arch in one direction. Inside, everything depended on money and rank, as I said at the start, and the difference was the difference between Raleigh's laboratory and a stone room with a straw pallet. The Tower charged for its own hospitality, prisoners paying fees to their keepers for food, coal, candles, bedding, and a poor prisoner who ran out of funds ran out of warmth and dinner in the same week. Winters in unheated stone brought men down with what the age called jail fever, typhus, carried by the lice that carried themselves on everyone, and the records are dotted with prisoners who cheated their scheduled executions by weeks, dying in bed of fever before the paperwork matured. Bishop Fisher's begging letter for a shirt came out of that world. So did the accounts of prisoners petitioning over and over in surviving letters for a servant, for a physician, for permission to walk on the rooftops, for half an hour of sky. and above all the waiting was scored with sound. The tower was a working fortress in the middle of a city, and condemned prisoners heard everything, the crowds gathering on the hill on execution mornings, the roar that meant a head had come off, and, worst of all, carpentry. Scaffolds were built to order, close under the walls, and more than one prisoner has left us the detail of lying in a cell through the night, listening to hammering and knowing exactly what was being assembled, and for whom. Catherine Howard, rehearsing with the block, was one answer to that torment, taking control of the one variable left. Others prayed, carved walls, went mad quietly, or like Jane Rochford, not quietly. The fortress never needed to touch most of its prisoners. It just let them listen. Where they ended up, at least the ones killed within the walls or on the hill, was the small chapel in the corner, St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains. And this is the dig from the very start of the video, the sinking pavement and the crowded earth. So now you know who the diggers were standing over. Victoria's restoration order came down in 1876, with instructions that everything be done with the greatest care and reverence, and what the lifted floor gave the workmen was chaos. The bodies of the Tudor dead had been put down fast, in shallow, crowded, unmarked ground, coffins ordered thin or, as we know in Anne Boleyn's case, improvised, and centuries of later burials, repairs, and drain-laying had churned the whole plot, so that the excavators brought up the remains of hundreds of individuals, broken and mingled together, bones in fragments, resting in no order at all. In the spot where tradition and the old records placed Anne Boleyn, they found the bones of a slight, delicately built woman, and the examining surgeon, Dr. Muat, wrote up a description that comes out half autopsy, half eulogy: a well-formed head, small and feminine bones, hands and feet notably fine, and vertebrae remarkable for their smallness. The little neck, he was in no doubt, of a female of between 25 and 30 years of age. His age estimate has been argued with ever since by some reckonings, Anne was several years past 30 when she died, and neighbouring graves held other slight women, so the identification rests on position and plausibility rather than proof, and the Victorians themselves, to their credit, said as much. What they found, they treated well. The identified remains were sealed in thick containers, soldered shut, boxed in oak with engraved plates naming each presumed occupant, and returned to the exact spots they came from, under a new marble pavement whose inlaid tiles today carry the names Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Grey, Margaret Pole, Monmouth and the rest, so that visitors stand on a floor that is effectively a mass grave with a polite index. The unidentified hundreds went into the crypt together. A later constable of the Tower wrote the sentence that has followed the chapel around ever since, borrowed from the historian Macaulay, that in truth there is no sadder spot on the earth than that little cemetery. The fortress kept other captives besides people, and since we're cataloguing its cruelties, the animals deserve their paragraph. For 600 years, the tower housed the royal menagerie, beginning in the 1200s with leopards, an elephant that died within 2 years on a diet nobody understood, red wine included, and a polar bear kept on a long chain so it could fish for its own dinner in the Thames, which as an image is almost charming until you dwell on the chain. Later centuries packed the place with lions in cramped stone dens, and under some monarchs the animals were baited for entertainment, dogs set on them in a pit while the court watched from a gallery. Losses ran constant, animals dying of cold, of wrong food, of proximity to each other, and the keepers fared little better. The records holding a steady drip of maulings, including, near the end, a keeper savaged after decades of service, and visitor injuries that finally shamed the operation. In the 1830s, the whole collection was shut down and shipped to the new zoo in Regent's Park, and the tower's only resident beasts thereafter were the ravens, which suits the building, honestly, carrion birds pacing a graveyard. The legend attached to them that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the fortress and the kingdom fall with it, gets told as ancient, and the paper trail behind it runs suspiciously warm, with little trace before the Victorian era, and some evidence the whole tradition congealed in the age of tourism. The government hedges anyway. The ravens are kept on clipped wings, enlisted like soldiers, and cared for by a raven master, and during the Second World War, when bombing had killed all but one of them, Churchill ordered the flock quietly restocked. Whatever the legend's birthday, nobody in authority has ever felt like testing it. By the 19th century, the tower had softened into a tourist attraction, moat drained, beefeaters posing, the axe and block on display as curiosities, and a reasonable person visiting in 1913 would have told you its killing days were as dead as the Plantagenets. Then the First World War arrived, and the old fortress went back to work. Germany had seeded Britain with spies, most of them amateurish, recruited fast and trained barely, sending reports on shipping in schoolboy codes and invisible ink, and as counterintelligence rolled them up, the question arose of where convicted enemy agents should die. The answer, with a symbolism nobody in authority ever spelled out, was the Tower of London. Between 1914 and 1916, 11 men were shot there, and the place chosen was almost insultingly mundane. The miniature rifle range, a long, narrow shed of corrugated iron squeezed between the inner and outer walls, where the garrison did its target practice. In place of the hill and the crowd, a chair from the guardroom, a wall of sandbags, and 8 soldiers detailed after breakfast. The men who carried out the first of the 11 never forgot him. Karl Hans Lodi was a German Naval Reserve officer who had worked for a shipping line and spoke English with an American accent, and in the first weeks of the war he was sent, with almost no training, to Edinburgh to report on the British fleet. He signed his telegrams Charles Inglis and wrote to cover addresses in Stockholm that British intelligence was already watching, so nearly everything he sent was intercepted, and one of his messages was allowed through, apparently because its contents, a wild rumor about Russian troops passing through Britain, suited the British fine. They arrested him in Ireland in October 1914. At his court-martial held publicly, Lodi refused to name his superiors, took full responsibility, and impressed everyone in the room, admitting what he had done and declining to grovel about it. A fellow officer wrote that he had never seen a braver man. He was sentenced to be shot at the Tower. In his last night, in the casemates, Lodi wrote 2 letters. One went to his family in Stuttgart, telling them a hero's death on the battlefield is certainly finer, but such is not to be my lot, and asking them to feel no shame. The other he addressed to the commanding officer of the guard detail that had held him, and it survives, and I'll give you its heart. I feel it my duty as a German officer, he wrote, to express my sincere thanks and appreciation towards the staff of officers and men who were in charge of my person during my confinement. Their kind and considered treatment has called my highest esteem and admiration as regards good fellowship even towards the enemy. And if I may be permitted, I would thank you for making this known to them. A condemned spy writing a thank you note to his jailers. On the morning of the 6th of November 1914, the assistant provost marshal came to walk him to the rifle range, and Lodi turned to him and said, "I suppose you will not care to shake hands with a German spy." The officer answered, "No, but I will shake hands with a brave man." They shook hands. Lodi walked to the shed through a raw, dark morning, steady the whole way, declined to be bound by some accounts, sat in the chair, and the volley ended him. He was the first person executed in the Tower of London in 167 years. And today, a plaque in his hometown and a mention in the Tower's own displays remember him. An enemy the fortress itself came closest to admiring. The 10 who followed him made a sadder procession. Karl Müller, a middle-aged businessman who wrote his reports in lemon juice between the lines of commercial letters, went to the chair in June 1915, and British intelligence, in one of the war's blacker jokes, kept his network's channel alive afterward, writing to his German paymasters in his name and collecting his salary, some of the money reportedly going toward an office car. Heike Janssen and Willem Roos, 2 Dutchmen posing as travelling cigar salesmen whose telegraphed orders for thousands of cigars mapped neatly onto warship movements, were shot 10 minutes apart on the same July morning, one at the rifle range and one at the Tower ditch. So the volleys would not unnerve the second man, though he heard the first all the same. Ernst Melin, a quiet Swede. Augusto Roggen, a Uruguayan who bought a fishing license for a loch beside a torpedo range. Fernando Bushman, a young Brazilian-born violinist, kept his violin with him in the casemates through his last night and played for hours, and in the morning at the range he kissed the instrument and said, "Goodbye, I shall not want you any more," and refused the blindfold. Georg Bricow, who had posed as an American piano dealer, was so undone at the end that they seated him already collapsed, and the file records he died of heart failure a fraction before the bullets properly did their work, a man frightened to death at the instant of being shot. Irving Guy Reese, travelling on a forged American passport. Albert Meyer, barely more than a boy, defiant to the chair. And last, in April 1916, Ludovico Hervitzi Zender, a Peruvian whose coded orders for tinned fish gave him away. 11 chairs, 11 mornings, and then the shed went back to target practice, and the tower assumed again that it was finished. One more prisoner of that war belongs on the roll, and his name still carries weight in another country. Sir Roger Casement, the celebrated humanitarian turned Irish revolutionary, was held in the Tower in 1916 after landing from a German submarine before the Easter Rising, kept under suicide watch in conditions that drew protests, and though he was tried and hanged elsewhere, at Pentonville, his few weeks in the fortress put him on the same roll as the priests and the earls, the last famous prisoner of conscience the Tower ever held under threat of death. And with him the First World War's business there closed. The Second World War brought the bombs to the Tower itself, high explosive into the moat and the old buildings, a direct hit that killed a yeoman warder at his post, the ravens dead in the raids until one remained. It also brought, for 4 days in May 1941, the most improbable lodger in the building's 9 centuries, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Germany, who had flown himself to Scotland on a doomed personal peace mission and parachuted into a farmer's field, and was parked in the Tower while the government worked out what on earth to do with him. He stayed less than a week, the last state prisoner of the Tower of London, and was moved on to spend the rest of his life in other cages. The fortress had one appointment left. Joseph Jacobs was a German army sergeant, a meteorologist by assignment, middle-aged, a dentist in civilian life, with a wife and 3 children in Berlin. On the night of the 31st of January 1941, he was pushed out of a Dornier over the Huntingdonshire countryside with a radio set, £497 in notes, forged identity papers, and a German sausage in his pocket, and his mission was to report weather conditions for the bombing campaign. The jump went wrong immediately. His ankle broke, some accounts say on exit from the aircraft, others on the frozen field, and either way Joseph Jacobs landed in the English mud unable to stand, let alone walk, and lay there through the freezing night in his flying suit, alone in enemy country with a shattered ankle. When daylight came, he did the only thing left. He fired his pistol into the air until someone came. 2 farm workers found him, a middle-aged man half frozen in a ploughed field, helpless, still wearing his parachute harness, and he surrendered without any resistance because none was available to him. The Home Guard carted him away in a wheelbarrow by one telling, and the radio, the cash, and the sausage told the rest of his story for him. What decided his fate was a technicality of status. The civilian spies of that war were tried in civilian courts and hanged at Wandsworth or Pentonville. Jacobs was a serving soldier of the German army, captured in uniform terms as an enemy combatant engaged in espionage, so he went before a military court instead. A court-martial held in camera at the Duke of York's headquarters in Chelsea in early August 1941. His defense was that he never intended to spy at all, that he meant to give himself up from the start, and the prosecution answer sat in the evidence bags, the code discs, the transmitter, the money. It took the court little time. The sentence of a military court was military, death by shooting, and the army's designated place for such things, by the precedent of the last war, was the Tower of London. His broken ankle had never healed properly. He could not stand to face the squad, and so the arrangements were made. A brown Windsor chair fetched from the officers' mess, the straps, the sandbagged wall of the miniature rifle range. On the morning of the 15th of August 1941, Joseph Jacobs was carried to the range and seated. He had spent his last hours with a Catholic chaplain, had written to his wife, and by the accounts of the officers present, he was entirely composed, more composed than some of the firing party. A white cotton patch was pinned over his heart as the aiming mark. The blindfold went on, and the 8 Scots guardsmen took their rifles from the rack, 3 loaded with blanks. He had asked that no order be shouted, so the officer commanding raised his hand for ready and dropped it for fire, and at 7:12 the volley came. 5 rounds through the white patch, and the medical officer pronounced death instantaneous. His reported last words to the squad, passed down through the garrison, were, "Shoot straight, Tommies." He was 43 years old, the last of the 12 the rifles took there, and the final person ever executed inside the Tower of London, 900 years, near enough, after the first Norman stone went down. They buried him in an unmarked grave at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery at Kensal Green, in ground shared with strangers, and no stone names him there to this day. His family in Germany learned little for decades, and it fell to his granddaughter, generations later, to dig the file out of the archives and piece her grandfather back together. The broken ankle, the letters, the chaplain, the chair. The tower, for its part, kept the chair. The brown Windsor chair, an ordinary piece of mess furniture with the bullet damage still in its back, was quietly preserved, and it sits today in the collection of the Royal Armouries, the last instrument of execution the Tower of London ever used. If you ever stand in front of it, look closely at the wood. The holes are still there. That's where I'll leave it tonight. Thank you for spending this one with me, all the way through 9 centuries of it. If anything in this story stuck with you, tell me about it in the comments. If you'd like to help keep these long, deep dives coming, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships are how that happens, and every link is in the description and the pinned comment. Look after yourselves, sleep well if you can after all that, and I'll see you in the next one.